Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that made your great-grandmother's mother clutch her pearls so hard they turned into dust. The 1920s flappers. Not the romantic, sepia-toned movie version. I mean the actual women who showed up to Sunday dinner with bobbed hair, cigarettes and opinions. Basically everything polite society feared most. So before you get comfortable, thank you for suggesting this topic. Really appreciate it. We're also officially on Spotify now, so check the description for that link. If you're vibing with what we're doing here, hit like and subscribe. About 80% of you watching aren't subscribed yet, and honestly, it makes a huge difference for us. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Now dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe tuck your feet in so the imaginary judgmental Victorian ghosts can't grab your toes. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be a flapper? Was it really just dancing and champagne, or was there something darker underneath all that fringe? Did they know they were rewriting the rule book, or did they just wake up one day and decide corsets were oppressive and ankles were meant to be seen? Could you survive in a world where your hair length was a political statement? Would you last a day in a speakeasy knowing one police raid could land you in the papers and ruin your family's reputation? What did it take to walk into a room full of scandalized faces and simply not care? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up at 1923. You're 22 years old, your hair is shockingly short, your dress is shockingly shorter, and your mother hasn't spoken to you in 6 weeks. The future is jazz-soaked, gin-flavoured, and moving faster than anyone can control. Good luck. Let's talk about what came before the flappers, this suffocating, corseted, ankle-length nightmare that was being a woman in the 1890s and early 1900s. You weren't just expected to dress modestly. You were expected to move like furniture, speak like a whisper, and exist like wallpaper. Women wore corsets so tight they literally couldn't breathe properly, skirts so heavy they could barely walk, and hats so elaborate they needed engineering degrees to stay upright. You weren't supposed to have opinions, ambitions, or visible ankles. Your job was to marry well, produce children, and disappear into domestic oblivion while your husband did literally everything else. The world was run by men who believed women were too delicate, too emotional, and too pure to handle things like voting, working, or having thoughts. And then World War I happened, and everything shattered. Imagine waking up every morning and being laced into a corset so tight your ribs ached. The process took at least 20 minutes and usually required help. Your mother or a maid would pull the laces while you gripped the bedpost, sucking in your stomach until breathing became a luxury rather than a right. Victorian doctors cheerfully ignored the fact that corsets caused fainting spells, digestive problems, and occasionally broken ribs. Instead, they insisted tight lacing was essential for maintaining feminine posture and moral virtue, because apparently your spine and your soul were connected. Once corseted, you'd add layers, a chemise, then petticoats, sometimes 5 or 6 of them, then the dress itself, which could weigh up to 15 pounds. The fabric dragged on the ground, collecting dirt, mud, and whatever unmentionable substances lined the streets. Walking required careful manoeuvring. Running was impossible. Sitting down was a calculated architectural feat. And heaven forbid you needed to use the bathroom because undressing required an engineering degree, and at least 10 minutes of privacy you probably didn't have. Your hair took another hour, it had to. Be long, pinned up, styled into elaborate arrangements that gave you headaches but proved you were civilized. Letting your hair down in public was basically advertising that you were a prostitute or insane, possibly both. Women's hair was considered deeply sexual, which is why it had to be hidden, controlled, contained at all times. The rules extended beyond clothing. A proper Victorian woman didn't laugh too loudly, express strong opinions, or show emotion beyond gentle, approved sentiments. She didn't work outside the home unless poverty forced her into a factory or domestic service. She didn't vote, own property, or control her own money once married. Her legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. She existed to be decorative, obedient, and quiet. Even her body wasn't her own. The ideal Victorian woman was pale, delicate, and slightly sickly looking. Robust health suggested you were lower class, someone who worked outdoors. Fainting was fashionable. Swooning proved you were refined. Some women deliberately cultivated fragility, taking arsenic or vinegar to maintain that coveted consumptive paleness. It's like Instagram filters, except deadly and socially mandated. And then came World War I, and suddenly all those delicate fainting ladies had to keep entire countries running while men killed each other in trenches. Women proved they could work 12-hour shifts in munitions factories, drive ambulances under fire, and make life-or-death decisions. And once they'd tasted that kind of agency, that kind of purpose, going back to fainting on sofas seemed less like femininity and more like a prison sentence. The Victorian cage had been unlocked, and the women who had become flappers were about to kick the door off its hinges. World War I didn't just kill millions of men, it accidentally liberated millions of women. When the soldiers marched off to die in trenches, someone had to keep society running. Suddenly women were working in factories driving ambulances, managing farms, and proving they could do everything men said they couldn't. They cut their hair short because long hair was impractical. They wore trousers because skirts got caught in machinery. They earned money, made decisions, and tasted independence for the first time in history. And when the war ended and men returned expecting life to go back to normal, women looked around and said, "Actually, no thanks." They'd seen what life could be without the cage, and they weren't about to climb back in. The genie was out of the bottle, and she was wearing pants and smoking a cigarette. The transformation started practically overnight. In 1914, respectable women didn't work. By 1915, they were everywhere, in factories assembling shells, in offices typing correspondence, in hospitals saving lives. The British government alone recruited nearly 1 million women into munitions factories. American women flooded into industries that had previously barred them. They operated heavy machinery, handled dangerous chemicals, and worked shifts their mothers would have considered physically impossible. The work was hard, often dangerous, and definitely not glamorous. Women in munitions factories handled TNT that turned their skin yellow, earning them the nickname Canary Girls. Their hair fell out, their hands blistered. Some died in explosions, but they kept working because the alternative was watching their countries collapse. And something interesting happened. They liked it. Not the danger, obviously, but the independence. They earned wages, sometimes good ones. They made friends. They felt useful, capable, powerful. Their appearance changed out of necessity. Long hair got caught in machinery, so they cut it, or pinned it severely back. Corsets were impossible in physically demanding jobs, so they wore simpler undergarments. Long skirts were hazards around equipment, so hemlines crept up to a scandalous mid-calf. Comfortable shoes replaced decorative torture devices. Women discovered that dressing for function rather than male approval felt like breathing fresh air for the first time. The social landscape shifted too. With millions of men dead or disabled, the marriage market collapsed. There simply weren't enough men to go around. Women who had expected to marry and be supported suddenly realized they'd need to support themselves. The old bargain, beauty and obedience in exchange for financial security, was off the table. So women adapted. They pursued education, careers, independence. When the war ended in 1918, governments and returning soldiers expected women to happily return to domestic life. Some women did, gladly trading factory floors for their own homes, but many others refused. They'd tasted freedom, earned their own money, made their own decisions. Going back to asking permission to leave the house felt suffocating. They'd proven they were strong, capable, essential, and they weren't about to pretend otherwise just to make men comfortable. The war also changed women psychologically. They'd lived through 4 years of death, grief, and uncertainty. The old Victorian emphasis on delicacy and propriety seemed absurd in the face of such massive loss. Why waste your life being polite when you might not have a tomorrow? This existential shift, this sense that life was short and should be lived fully, became the emotional foundation of the flapper era. World War I didn't just change what women could do, it changed what they wanted, and what they wanted was everything. You'd think cutting your hair would be a personal decision, but in the early 1920s, chopping off your locks was basically declaring war on society. Long hair had been sacred for centuries, a symbol of femininity, purity, and marriageability. Women were supposed to pin it up, braid it, and never, ever cut it. Then along came the bob, a sharp, chin-length cut that was fast, modern, and utterly scandalizing. When women started walking into barbershops and asking for the chop, parents wept. Preachers condemned it from pulpits. Newspapers ran alarmist headlines. Some women were even disowned by their families, but flappers didn't care. The bob was freedom. No more hours pinning up heavy coils, no more headaches, no more pretending to be delicate. It was practical, rebellious, and impossibly chic. Cutting your hair wasn't just a style choice, it was a middle finger to every rule that said women had to be ornamental. The bob first appeared among avant-garde actresses and artists before World War I, but it exploded into mainstream culture around 1920. Dancer Irene Castle is often credited with popularising it, though some fashion historians trace it back to Paris. Regardless of origin, the effect was immediate and shocking. Women who had spent their entire lives growing, brushing and styling their hair suddenly walked into barbershops, men's barbershops, and asked for it all to be cut off. Barbers were confused. Hairdressers were scandalised. Many initially refused to cut women's hair short, insisting it was unnatural, immoral, or simply impossible given feminine hair texture. But women were determined. Some brought photographs of actresses. Others just pointed at male customers and said, "Like that, but prettier." The early bobs were often uneven, experimental, sometimes disastrous, but women kept trying, kept cutting, kept pushing. The backlash was immediate and vicious. Preachers devoted entire sermons to the spiritual dangers of short hair. They cited biblical passages about women's hair being their glory, and warned that bobbed women were rejecting God's design. Some churches refused to marry women with bobs, others banned them from choir or Sunday school. Parents threatened to disown daughters who cut their hair. Husbands issued ultimatums. Employers fired women for showing up with bobs, claiming it was unprofessional or distracting. The media fanned the flames with breathless, pearl-clutching coverage. Newspapers published letters from concerned citizens predicting social collapse. Magazines ran before and after photos with judgmental captions. Some publications held contests where readers could vote on whether the bob was attractive or hideous. Psychologists weighed in, suggesting that women who bobbed their hair were mentally unstable or seeking male attention in inappropriate ways. It was moral panic at its finest. A haircut treated like a national emergency. But the bob's symbolism went deeper than fashion. In psychological terms, cutting your hair was cutting ties with the past. It was a physical, visible, permanent rejection of Victorian femininity. You couldn't hide a bob under a hat or grow it back overnight. Once cut, you were marked as modern, rebellious, possibly dangerous. And that's exactly what flappers wanted. The bob was a signal, a way of identifying fellow rule breakers. When you saw another woman with a bob, you knew she'd made the same choice, taken the same risk. The bob also had practical advantages that are easy to overlook. Victorian hairstyles required hours of daily maintenance: washing, drying, brushing, pinning. Long hair was heavy, hot, and high maintenance. The bob took minutes to style. You could wash and dry it quickly. It stayed neat through dancing, working, or running for the streetcar. For women living fast-paced urban lives, the bob wasn't just stylish, it was efficient. It freed up time, energy, and mental space previously devoted to hair management. By the mid-1920s, the bob had won. Even women who initially resisted were cutting their hair. Hairdressers who had refused to offer the service now specialised in it. The bob evolved into variations: the shingle, the Eton crop, finger waves. But the revolution it represented remained the same. Women were taking control of their own bodies, one haircut at a time. If the bob was controversial, hemlines were a full-blown scandal. For centuries, women's dresses had swept the floor, hiding every inch of leg as if ankles were classified state secrets. Then, in the 1920s, skirts started creeping upward, first to mid-calf, then to the knee, and sometimes even higher when a flapper was dancing. Conservatives lost their minds. Ministers preached that short skirts were the devil's work. Schools banned them. Some states even tried to pass laws regulating hem length, because apparently the government had nothing better to do. But flappers loved it. Shorter skirts meant freedom to move, to dance, to run for the streetcar without tripping over 5 pounds of fabric. It wasn't about being scandalous, it was about being human. Still, every time a flapper walked down the street showing her calves, someone, somewhere clutched their pearls and whispered, "What is the world coming to?" The rise in hemlines didn't happen overnight. Fashion historians can track it year by year, inch by inch, like a slow-motion revolution. In 1919, hemlines hovered around mid-calf, already shocking compared to pre-war ankle-length skirts. By 1922, they'd climbed to just below the knee, and by 1927, they'd reached the knee or sometimes slightly above, especially for evening wear or dancing. This doesn't sound like much by modern standards, but at the time, it was seismic. Women's legs had been hidden for so long that revealing them felt almost pornographic to conservative onlookers. Ankles had been considered mildly erotic in the Victorian era. Calves were definitely sexual. Knees were absolutely scandalous. Showing your knee in public was akin to walking around in lingerie by 19th century standards. The practical advantages were undeniable. Shorter skirts made walking easier, faster and safer. Women weren't constantly tripping over hems or getting fabric caught indoors. They could climb stairs without gathering armfuls of skirt. They could dance without their partner stepping on yards of fabric. They could run, actually run, which had been nearly impossible in pre-war clothing. For women who commuted, worked and participated in active social lives, shorter skirts were liberation. But practical concerns weren't the only motivation. Shorter skirts were also sexy, modern, youthful. They showed off fashionable stockings, which became an essential part of the flapper look. Women rolled their stockings below the knee, sometimes decoratively, creating visual interest and emphasizing the leg. The whole silhouette was different, where Victorian dresses had emphasized the waist and hips, creating an hourglass. Flapper dresses hung straight from the shoulders, creating a boyish, streamlined shape that emphasized legs and movement. The backlash was predictable but intense. Religious leaders condemned short skirts from every pulpit. Catholic bishops in Cincinnati proposed a pledge where women would promise to keep their skirts at least 7 inches below the knee. Protestant ministers organised anti-short skirt campaigns, complete with rallies and leaflets. Some argued that short skirts were causing moral decay, leading to increased sexuality, promiscuity and disrespect for traditional values. Schools became battlegrounds. Principals instituted dress codes requiring specific hem lengths, often measured with rulers. Girls who violated the rules were sent home, suspended, or in extreme cases expelled. Some schools made students kneel and measured the distance from knee to hem. If it was less than a prescribed length, the student was in trouble. The absurdity of grown adults obsessing over teenage girls' hemlines apparently escaped these authorities. Some communities tried legal intervention. Utah considered legislation requiring skirts to be within 3 inches of the ankle. Virginia attempted to criminalize dresses that showed more than 3 inches above the ankle. In some cities, women were actually arrested for wearing skirts that were deemed too short. The charges varied: indecent exposure, public indecency, or vague morality violations, but the message was clear. Society wanted to control women's bodies, and clothing was the battlefield. But flappers didn't back down. If anything, the opposition made them more determined. Every arrest, every sermon, every hand-wringing editorial proved their point. Men were terrified of women's freedom. And that terror was delicious. Shorter skirts became badges of courage, visible proof that you refused to be controlled. When flappers hitched up their hemlines, they weren't just showing their legs, they were showing their independence. And no amount of pearl clutching was going to change that. Before the 1920s, respectable women didn't wear makeup. Lipstick, rouge, and powder were for actresses, prostitutes, and other women polite society pretended didn't exist. A proper lady's beauty was supposed to be natural, effortless, and invisible, which mostly meant pale, tired, and boring. Then flappers said, "Screw that," and painted their faces like works of art. Dark lips, heavily lined eyes, rouged cheeks. They weren't trying to look natural, they were trying to look fabulous. Wearing makeup became an act of rebellion, a way to control your own image and reject the idea that beauty had to be demure. Cosmetics companies exploded. Compacts became must-have accessories, and suddenly, every woman who dared to wear lipstick was making a statement. I decide how I look, not you. The Victorian attitude toward makeup was rooted in morality and class. Respectable women were supposed to be naturally beautiful. Pale skin, rosy cheeks, pink lips, all achieved without artificial enhancement. Makeup was associated with the theatre, and by extension with women of questionable virtue. Actresses wore makeup on stage, and actresses were considered scandalous by default. Women who worked in certain professions, prostitutes, dancers, performers, wore obvious makeup to attract attention. Good women did neither. But World War I changed this, as it changed everything else. Women working in factories and offices didn't have time for the Victorian beauty ideal. They were tired, stressed, and often looked it. Makeup offered a quick way to appear polished and professional. It was practical. And as women gained independence, they started questioning why makeup should be stigmatized. Who decided that natural was more moral than painted? Why was controlling your appearance through cosmetics any worse than controlling it through corsets and elaborate hairstyles? The cosmetics industry, smelling profit, launched aggressive marketing campaigns aimed directly at young women. Companies like Max Factor, Maybelline, and Elizabeth Arden positioned makeup as modern, sophisticated, and empowering. Advertisements featured glamorous flappers applying lipstick with confidence. The message was clear: modern women enhanced their beauty. They didn't apologize for it. Compact, small, portable makeup containers became fashionable accessories. Pulling out a compact to powder your nose in public was a bold, visible act of self-maintenance. The flapper makeup look was distinctive and dramatic. Lips were painted dark red or deep burgundy in a cupid's bow shape. The top lip peaked in the center, creating an exaggerated pout. Eyes were heavily lined with kohl, creating a sultry, smoky effect. Eyebrows were plucked into thin dramatic arches. Cheeks were rouged in circular shapes, placed high on the cheekbones. The overall effect was theatrical, doll-like, decidedly artificial, and that was the point. Flappers weren't trying to look natural. They were creating a look, a persona, a statement. The backlash was predictable. Religious leaders condemned makeup as vanity and deception. Doctors warned that cosmetics contained dangerous chemicals which, to be fair, some did. Early 20th century makeup often contained lead, mercury, and other toxic substances. But flappers didn't care about health warnings any more than they cared about moral ones. They wanted to look good, feel confident, and control their own faces. Men had mixed reactions. Some found the bold makeup attractive, exciting, modern. Others were repelled, calling it garish or cheap-looking. Some complained that makeup was deceptive, that men couldn't tell what women really looked like. This complaint reveals the entitlement beneath the criticism, the assumption that women's appearances existed primarily for male assessment, and that women owed men unvarnished honesty about their looks. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of the makeup trend was what it represented psychologically. When a woman put on lipstick, she was making a choice about her own face. She was saying, "I decide how I want to look, not society, not men, not tradition." Every application of rouge was a tiny act of self-determination. Every drawn-on eyebrow was a rejection of natural passivity. Makeup became armor, war paint, a way of facing the world on your own terms. By the mid-1920s, wearing makeup had become normalized among young urban women. What had been scandalous was now standard. Even older women began experimenting with light powder and subtle lip color. The beauty industry had been transformed, and so had the relationship between women and their own faces. Flappers had painted themselves into existence, and the world would never look the same again. For centuries, the corset had been women's daily torture device, a cage of whalebone and laces designed to squeeze waists into impossibly tiny shapes, push breasts upward, and make breathing optional. Women fainted regularly, not because they were delicate flowers, but because their internal organs were being crushed. Then the 1920s arrived, and flappers threw their corsets in the trash. The new silhouette was straight, boyish, and loose. Dresses hung from the shoulders, not the waist. Freedom of movement replaced the hourglass figure. You could dance, bend, sit, and breathe without worrying about snapping a rib. Older generations were horrified. They thought the corset was moral support, literally holding women's bodies and virtue in place. Removing it felt like societal collapse. But flappers didn't care. They tasted comfort, and there was no going back. The corset's grip on Western fashion had lasted centuries. It shaped the ideal female silhouette from the Renaissance through the Victorian era, a tiny waist emphasized by exaggerated hips and bust. Achieving this look required serious structural engineering. Corsets were made from heavy fabric, reinforced with whalebone, steel, or cane. They laced up the back, pulling tighter and tighter until your waist measured whatever impossible circumference was fashionable, sometimes as small as 18 inches. The health consequences were severe and well documented, though largely ignored. Tight lacing compressed internal organs, particularly the liver, stomach, and intestines. This led to digestive problems, difficulty eating, and chronic pain. Breathing was restricted, causing fainting spells, which Victorian culture perversely considered feminine and desirable. Ribs could crack. Posture was permanently altered. Some women suffered from atrophied core muscles because the corset did all the work of holding them upright. But the corset wasn't just physical restraint, it was social control. It literally restricted women's movement, making running, bending, or any vigorous activity difficult or impossible. It required assistants to put on and take off, meaning women needed help to dress and undress, reinforcing their dependence on others. And it was a daily reminder that women's natural bodies were unacceptable, that they needed to be shaped, controlled, compressed into an artificial ideal. World War I dealt the corset its first serious blow. Women working in factories couldn't wear restrictive undergarments. They needed to move freely, quickly, efficiently. Looser undergarments became practical necessities, and once women experienced the freedom of breathing fully, moving easily, and not feeling constantly constricted, they didn't want to go back. The fashion industry caught up in the early 1920s. The new flapper silhouette required a completely different foundation. Instead of emphasizing the waist, flapper fashion de-emphasized it, creating a straight line from shoulder to hip. This required bandeaus or soft bras that flattened rather than enhanced. Some flappers even bound their breasts to achieve a more boyish look, which had its own health issues but at least didn't involve metal stays piercing your organs. The shift from corset to lighter undergarments represented a massive change in how women's bodies were conceptualized. The Victorian ideal had been all curves, exaggerated, sculpted, artificially created. The flapper ideal was streamlined, athletic, youthful. It valued movement over stasis, function over form. A flapper's body was meant to dance, walk, work, live, not sit decoratively in a parlour. Older generations were genuinely horrified by this shift. To them, the corset wasn't just undergarment, it was civilization. They believed it provided physical support that women's supposedly weak bodies needed. They thought it promoted good posture and moral discipline. Removing it seemed reckless, dangerous, almost barbaric. Articles appeared in conservative publications warning that women without corsets would develop back problems, poor posture, and moral looseness. The logic was Victorian. If you weren't physically restrained, you wouldn't restrain your behaviour either. Medical professionals were divided. Some doctors welcomed the change, pointing out the obvious health benefits of not crushing your organs daily. Others, particularly older male physicians, warned against it. They trotted out pseudoscientific claims about women's bodies needing external support, about the dangers of unrestricted movement, about maintaining proper feminine form. But flappers were unmoved by these arguments. They'd experienced both ways of being, corseted and free won, hands down. Yes, their bodies looked different. Yes, they'd rejected centuries of beauty standards, but they could breathe, they could move, they could dance all night without fainting, they could bend over without gasping, they could exist in their bodies comfortably, maybe for the first time in their lives. The death of the corset was also symbolic of a broader shift. Women were reclaiming authority over their own bodies. They were deciding what felt good, what looked good, what worked for their lives, not what society or men or fashion dictated. Every corset thrown away was a small declaration of independence, and by the time the 1920s ended, that independence was permanent. The corset would never fully return. Women had tasted freedom, and they weren't about to be caged again. Flappers didn't just dance, they exploded onto the dance floor like their lives depended on it. The Charleston, the black bottom, the shimmy. These weren't your grandmother's waltzes. They were fast, frenetic, and wildly improper. Legs kicked, hips swayed, arms flailed, and skirts flew upward in ways that made chaperones faint. Jazz music was the soundtrack, pulsing and syncopated and utterly irresistible. Ballrooms that had once been stiff and formal turned into sweaty, joyful chaos. Dancing became a social revolution. It broke down class barriers because everyone could learn the Charleston. It scandalized the older generation because it involved touching, moving, and having visible fun. And it gave women a way to express themselves physically in a world that had spent centuries telling them to sit still and be quiet. For flappers, Dancing wasn't just entertainment, it was liberation set to a beat. Pre-war dancing had been rigid, formal, controlled. The waltz, the foxtrot, even the tango, all required specific steps, close partnership with a male lead, and careful propriety. Dancing was something you did in ballrooms with chaperones watching. It was courtship under supervision. You held your partner at a respectable distance, followed the prescribed steps, and God forbid you improvise or show too much enthusiasm. Then came jazz, and jazz didn't care about rules. The music was syncopated, unpredictable, infectious. It made you want to move, not in prescribed patterns, but however your body wanted. And the dances that emerged from jazz clubs were nothing like ballroom dancing. They were wild, improvisational, individual. You didn't need a partner. You didn't need training. You just needed rhythm and the willingness to look ridiculous. The Charleston became the defining dance of the era. Developed by African Americans in Charleston, South Carolina, it exploded into mainstream culture around 1923. The basic steps involved kicking your legs out while moving your feet in and out, arms swinging in opposition. It looked chaotic and absurd, knees knocking together, arms flailing, but it was joyful, energetic, impossible not to smile while doing. And it was fast. Charleston competitions became popular, with dancers competing to see who could sustain the pace longest without collapsing. The black bottom, another African-American dance, was even more scandalous. It involved hip movements, bottom shaking and suggestive gyrations that made the Charleston look tame. Conservatives were horrified. The Cleveland Board of Health actually banned public performances of the black bottom, declaring it injurious to health. The concern wasn't really about health. It was about the sexual nature of the movements, about women moving their bodies in ways that suggested pleasure and agency. The shimmy was exactly what it sounds like. Rapid shoulder and chest, movements that made everything shake. It required letting loose, abandoning control, and definitely made your breasts move in ways Victorian society would have considered apocalyptic. All of these dances shared common elements. They were fast, physically demanding, visually exciting, and absolutely impossible to do in a corset. They required loose clothing, comfortable shoes, and a willingness to sweat, pant, and potentially flash your knees. Dancing also became social. Before the war, dancing had been exclusive, something done at private balls or upscale venues. But in the 1920s, dance halls opened in cities everywhere. Some were fancy, but many were accessible to working-class young people. You could pay a small admission fee and dance all night. This democratization of dancing meant that clerks and secretaries could participate in the same culture as wealthy socialites. On the dance floor, class distinctions temporarily blurred. Dancing also created new forms of social mixing. Jazz clubs, especially, were often integrated spaces where white and black patrons danced together, something that was scandalous and sometimes illegal in other contexts. The Harlem Renaissance saw wealthy white flappers travelling uptown to dance in black clubs, attracted by the music, the energy, and the transgressive thrill of crossing racial boundaries. This mixing was complicated, often exploitative, rarely truly equal, but it represented a crack in the rigid racial segregation of the era. For women specifically, dancing offered a form of expression that had been denied them. Their bodies had been controlled, restricted, corseted, hidden. Dancing let them be physical, vigorous, visible. They could take up space, make noise, move however they wanted. They could lead or dance alone. They could be sexy without being sexual, joyful without being proper. And perhaps most radically, dancing was fun. Just fun. Not improving, not educational, not morally instructive, just pure, sweaty, exhausting pleasure. In a world that had spent centuries telling women that pleasure was dangerous, that their bodies were shameful, that they should be quiet and still, dancing was revolutionary. Every kick, Every shimmy, every breathless Charleston step was a tiny rebellion, and flappers danced like they knew it. Jazz was the heartbeat of the 1920s, and flappers were its biggest fans. Born in the black communities of New Orleans, jazz was improvisational, rebellious, and utterly alive. It didn't follow the rules of classical music. It broke them, bent them, and laughed while doing it. And that's exactly why flappers loved it. Jazz clubs became the epicenters of flapper culture, smoky, loud, integrated spaces where races and classes mixed in ways that horrified traditionalists. Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, these were the superstars, and flappers worshipped them. The music was fast, sexy, and impossible to sit still to. It made you want to move, to feel, to live. Conservative critics called jazz barbaric and morally corrupting, which only made flappers love it more. Jazz wasn't just music. It was the sound of a generation refusing to be tamed. Jazz emerged from African American communities in New Orleans in the early 1900s, blending blues, ragtime, and brass band traditions into something entirely new. It was black music, created by black musicians, rooted in black cultural traditions. This is essential context because jazz's mainstream explosion in the 20s involved both celebration and appropriation. White audiences fell in love with black art while often ignoring or exploiting the black artists who created it. What made jazz revolutionary was its structure, or lack thereof. Classical music followed strict rules, written scores, predictable progressions, formal arrangements. Jazz threw all that out. It was built on improvisation, with musicians riffing off each other in real time, creating something new in every performance. No two renditions of the same song were identical. This spontaneity, this creative freedom was intoxicating to young people who were themselves rejecting rigid social structures. The sound itself was unlike anything that had come before. Syncopated rhythms, beats that fell in unexpected places made you want to move. Brass instruments wailed and growled. Pianos pounded out complex progressions. Vocals ranged from smooth crooning to raw, emotional belting. Jazz was loud, energetic, uncontrollable. It couldn't be contained in polite concert halls. It exploded in clubs, speakeasies, dance halls. The Harlem Renaissance, flourishing throughout the 20s, made Harlem the epicenter of jazz culture. Clubs like the Cotton Club, the Savoy Ballroom, and Small's Paradise featured the era's greatest musicians. Wealthy white flappers would travel uptown to experience authentic jazz in its birthplace, a practice that was culturally complicated. While it provided black musicians with audiences and income, it also often involved exploitation, segregation within integrated spaces, and a troubling dynamic where white audiences consumed black culture without respecting black humanity. The biggest jazz stars became household names. Louis Armstrong revolutionized trumpet playing and vocal scat. Duke Ellington composed sophisticated arrangements that elevated jazz to high art. Bessie Smith's powerful voice earned her the title Empress of the Blues. Jelly Roll Morton, King Oliver, Fletcher Henderson. These musicians weren't just entertainers, they were innovators, artists creating America's first truly original art form. But jazz faced massive backlash from conservative America. It was called barbaric, primitive, savage, racist language that revealed the real issue. Jazz was black, and white America wasn't comfortable with black culture influencing their children. Religious leaders condemned it as devil music. The Ladies' Home Journal ran articles warning that jazz was morally corrupting young people. Some communities actually banned jazz performances, and schools prohibited students from attending jazz concerts. The criticism often focused on jazz's supposed sexual nature. The rhythms were called suggestive. The dancing it inspired was condemned as lewd. The close proximity of bodies in crowded clubs was deemed inappropriate. What really bothered critics was that jazz made people feel things: excitement, joy, desire, and those feelings couldn't be controlled or regulated. Flappers ignored all of it. They loved jazz precisely because it was rebellious, black-created, and impossible to resist. They bought jazz records for their Victrolas, the phonographs that brought music into homes. They learned the latest jazz dances. They memorized lyrics. They debated which musicians were best. Jazz became the soundtrack of their lives, playing in speakeasies, at parties, on dates, in their bedrooms. Jazz also represented something deeper than entertainment. It was American music created here, not imported from Europe. It was modern, forward-looking, innovative. It suggested that America's future would be defined not by stuffy tradition, but by creative energy, cultural mixing, and artistic freedom. For flappers who were themselves trying to create a new way of being, jazz was the perfect metaphor and the perfect soundtrack. Prohibition was supposed to save America from the evils of alcohol. Instead, it created an entire underground economy of illegal bars, bootleggers, and women drinking gin out of teacups. Enter the speakeasy, hidden clubs where jazz played, liquor flowed, and flappers danced until dawn. Getting in required a password, a connection, or a very convincing smile. Inside, the rules didn't apply. Women drank alongside men, smoked cigarettes, and flirted openly, all things that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Speakeasies were dangerous, thrilling, and deeply democratic. A secretary could rub elbows with a socialite. A black jazz musician could play for a white audience. Everyone was united by one thing: the shared thrill of breaking the law. Flappers loved speakeasies not just for the alcohol but for the freedom. For once they were the ones deciding where to go, what to drink, and who to be. The 18th Amendment, banning the manufacture and sale of alcohol, went into effect in January 1920. It was the culmination of decades of temperance movement activism, driven largely by women who had seen alcohol destroy families through domestic violence and financial ruin. The irony is that Prohibition, intended to protect women and children, ended up liberating young women in ways temperance activists never imagined. Within months of Prohibition's start, illegal drinking establishments began opening. They were called speakeasies, supposedly because you had to speak easy, quietly, about them to avoid detection. Some were fancy, elaborate operations with live bands, full kitchens, and ornate decor. Others were shabby back rooms with watered-down gin and a single musician. What they shared was illegality and the thrilling sense of getting away with something. Getting into a speakeasy was an adventure. Some required passwords that changed nightly. Others operated behind legitimate businesses. You'd enter through a bookstore or restaurant and knock on an unmarked door. Some had peepholes where you'd be scrutinized before entry. The secrecy added to the allure. You weren't just going out for a drink, you were participating in a conspiracy. Inside, speakeasies were revelatory for women. Before Prohibition, respectable women didn't drink in public. Bars and saloons were male spaces, and women who entered them were assumed to be prostitutes. But speakeasies, operating outside the law anyway, didn't follow those rules. Women were welcome customers. They drank openly, sitting at bars, ordering cocktails, getting drunk in public for the first time in American history. The cocktails themselves became more elaborate during Prohibition. Because illegal alcohol was often low quality, bootleggers didn't care about taste. Bartenders mixed it with juices, sodas, and flavoured syrups to mask the terrible flavour. This created cocktail culture. Drinks like the Bee's Knees, the Mary Pickford, and the Sidecar became popular. Carrying a flask became fashionable for both men and women. A hip flask tucked into a garter was a classic flapper accessory. Drinking gave women a form of social power. Alcohol lowered inhibitions, created camaraderie, facilitated flirtation. In speakeasies, women could approach men, start conversations, be bold. The old rules about waiting to be approached, being coy and passive, dissolved after a few drinks. Alcohol was liquid courage, and flappers drank it down. The democratic nature of speakeasies was also significant. Since they were illegal anyway, they often ignored racial segregation laws that governed legitimate businesses. Integrated speakeasies, particularly in cities like New York and Chicago, became spaces where black and white patrons mixed, danced together, and enjoyed the same music. This wasn't utopia. Racism didn't disappear just because everyone was breaking the law, but it was a step toward integration that wouldn't have happened in legal establishments. The danger was real, though. Speakeasies were raided regularly. Police, tipped off or simply patrolling, would burst in, arresting patrons and owners. Getting arrested could mean fines, jail time and public humiliation, your name printed in the newspaper, your reputation destroyed. For women especially, being arrested in a speakeasy could be devastating. It suggested moral looseness, impropriety, unfitness for respectable society. But flappers calculated the risk and decided it was worth it. The speakeasy represented everything they wanted: freedom, excitement, danger, equality, fun. It was a space where they could be themselves without judgment, where they could experiment with identities and behaviours that the daylight world condemned. Yes, they might get arrested. Yes, the alcohol might be poisonous, literally, as some bootleg liquor was. But the alternative, staying home, being good, following rules, felt like slow death. By the late 20s, speakeasies were everywhere. Estimates suggest New York City alone had over 30,000 illegal drinking establishments during Prohibition. Every neighbourhood had them. Everyone knew someone who knew where they were. And every weekend, flappers put on their best dresses, memorised the password, and slipped into the underground world where they could finally be free. When flappers lit up cigarettes in public, they weren't just satisfying a nicotine craving, they were committing cultural treason. For centuries, smoking had been a male privilege, something done in private clubs and back rooms while women stayed home and breathed clean air like good little angels. Then, flappers said, "Give us a light," and everything changed. Cigarette companies saw an opportunity and marketed heavily to women, selling smoking as modern, sophisticated and liberating. Flappers embraced it. A cigarette became an accessory, a prop, a statement. It said, "I do what I want." Conservatives were appalled. Smoking was unladylike, unhealthy and morally suspect. Some cities even tried to ban women from smoking in public, but flappers didn't care. They smoked on street corners, in speakeasies, at parties, daring anyone to stop them. Every exhale was a tiny rebellion. Before the 1920s, women who smoked were considered déclassées, either bohemian artists, prostitutes, or working-class women with no reputation to protect. Respectable women absolutely did not smoke, especially not in public. Smoking was coded male, associated with business, leisure, and a certain rough masculinity. Men smoked cigars in drawing rooms, cigarettes on street corners, pipes in studies. Women breathed their second-hand smoke and stayed silent. But during World War I, as with so many things, the rules shifted. Women working in factories and offices picked up cigarettes. They were a quick stress reliever during short breaks. Smoking helped suppress appetite when food was rationed. It provided a moment of pause in exhausting days. And since women were already breaking gender barriers by working, smoking seemed like a minor additional transgression. After the war, cigarette companies recognized a massive untapped market: women. But they faced a problem. Smoking was still stigmatized for women, so they launched sophisticated marketing campaigns explicitly designed to make smoking feminine, fashionable, and empowering. Lucky Strike's infamous Reach for a Lucky. Instead of a sweet campaign targeted women's weight consciousness, suggesting cigarettes were appetite suppressants. Other campaigns showed elegant women with cigarettes, linking smoking to sophistication and glamour. Perhaps the most famous publicity stunt was Edward Bernays' Torches of Freedom March during the 1929 Easter Parade. Bernays, working for tobacco companies, hired fashionable young women to light cigarettes publicly during the parade while marching under a banner about women's freedom. Reporters were tipped off beforehand, ensuring widespread coverage. The message, smoking was feminist, a symbol of liberation. Flappers bought it, or maybe they already wanted it, and the marketing simply gave them permission. Cigarettes became essential flapper accessories. A long cigarette holder became fashionable, allowing women to smoke without staining their fingers. Silver or gold cases became status symbols. The act of smoking became performative, pulling out a case, selecting a cigarette, waiting for a light, inhaling dramatically, exhaling in a thin stream. It was theatre, and flappers were the stars. The symbolism was powerful. Smoking required fire. You needed someone to light your cigarette, creating an opportunity for interaction. Asking for a light was a socially acceptable way to start a conversation, especially between strangers. The act of sharing a lighter or match was intimate. Smoking together created camaraderie. Standing in a group of smokers, cigarettes in hand, flappers looked rebellious, sophisticated, worldly, but the backlash was severe. Religious leaders condemned smoking as sinful. Doctors warned about health effects, and unlike the moral arguments, this criticism had merit. Smoking causes cancer, heart disease, respiratory problems. But in the 1920s, these risks weren't widely understood or publicized. The criticism women faced was moral, not medical. Some cities passed ordinances specifically prohibiting women from smoking in public spaces. In 1922, a New York City ordinance threatened to revoke the licenses of restaurants that allowed women to smoke. Women were arrested for smoking on street corners. Schools expelled female students caught smoking. Families disowned daughters who picked up the habit. The gendered double standard was obvious and infuriating. Men could smoke anywhere, anytime, without judgment. But women's smoking suggested loose morals, poor breeding, sexual availability. The logic was Victorian. If a woman would put a cigarette in her mouth in public, what else might she put in her mouth? The sexual implications were rarely stated explicitly but always present. Flappers responded with defiance. They smoked more publicly, more visibly, more proudly. They posed for photographs with cigarettes dangling from their lips. They included cigarettes in their fashion illustrations. They made smoking part of the flapper uniform, as essential as bobbed hair and short skirts. And they were right to see it as political. Smoking was about bodily autonomy, the right to decide what to put in your own body. It was about rejecting the pedestal of feminine purity. Victorian women were supposed to be clean, pure, untouched by anything corrupting. Flappers inhaled smoke, stained their fingers, and announced they were human, not angels. By the end of the decade, women smoking had been normalized among urban young people. What had been scandalous became commonplace. Cigarette ads featuring women appeared in mainstream magazines. Smoking rates among women skyrocketed, a public health disaster certainly, but also a victory for personal freedom. Today, knowing what we know about smoking's health effects, it's hard to celebrate this particular rebellion, but context matters. Flappers weren't choosing cigarettes knowing they'd die of lung cancer. They were choosing autonomy knowing they'd be condemned for it. Every cigarette was a small claim to personhood, a tiny declaration. My body, my choice. And in the 1920s, that message was revolutionary, even if the method of delivery was toxic. Before cars, women's mobility was limited. You walked, took a streetcar, or waited for a man to drive you somewhere. Then the automobile became affordable, and suddenly women could go wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. Flappers loved cars. They learned to drive, bought their own vehicles, and hit the open road with friends. No chaperones required. Cars meant dates without supervision, midnight joyrides, and the ability to escape small-town judgment. Parents hated it. They called cars bedrooms on wheels and worried about what unsupervised young people might do in the back seat. They weren't entirely wrong. But for flappers, cars represented something deeper than just transportation. They were freedom, independence, and the ability to leave the past in the dust. The automobile revolution happened fast. In 1900, cars were expensive toys for the wealthy. By 1920, thanks to Henry Ford's assembly line and mass production, the Model T cost less than $300, roughly 3 months' salary for a working woman. Cars became accessible not just to the rich but to the middle class, and that changed everything. For women specifically, cars represented unprecedented mobility. Before automobiles, a woman's geographic range was limited by how far she could walk or what public transportation was available. If you wanted to go somewhere your parents didn't approve of, you needed elaborate lies and complicated logistics. With a car, you just drove. No explanations, no permissions, no one tracking your movements. You could visit friends across town, drive to neighbouring cities, take spontaneous road trips. Your world expanded from a few walkable blocks to hundreds of miles. Learning to drive was itself an act of rebellion. Driving required mechanical knowledge, physical coordination, and confidence, all things women supposedly lacked according to popular prejudice. Early automobiles weren't easy to operate. You had to hand crank them to start, which required strength. You had to understand basic mechanics because breakdowns were common. You had to navigate without GPS, reading maps and asking directions. Critics insisted women couldn't possibly handle all this. Women proved them wrong, one drive at a time. Some flappers didn't just drive, they became racing enthusiasts. Women like Louise Hitchcock and Ruth Whiteman competed in races, set speed records, and proved women could handle high-performance vehicles. These weren't publicity stunts. These were serious athletes pushing boundaries. Their success challenged fundamental assumptions about women's capabilities, about their nerve, their strength, their competitiveness. But it was the social implications of automobiles that really scandalized parents and clergy. Cars created private spaces on wheels. A couple could drive somewhere isolated, a country road, a secluded park, a quiet overlook, and be completely alone, unsupervised for hours. What might they do in that privacy? Everything parents feared, probably. The term parking, driving to a secluded spot to make out, entered the vocabulary. Cars became associated with sexual freedom and moral danger. The bedroom on wheels, panic was real and widespread. Ministers preached sermons about the dangers of automobiles. Schools warned students about proper conduct in cars. Some communities considered curfews or regulations specifically targeting young people in automobiles. There were calls for chaperones to be required even in cars, though this was obviously impractical and unenforceable. What really worried adults was the loss of control. For centuries, young people's behaviour had been monitored through physical proximity. Chaperones sat in parlours. Parents watched from windows. Communities observed who was walking with whom. But cars made surveillance impossible. Once a flapper got behind the wheel, she disappeared from adult supervision. She might be exactly where she said she'd be, doing exactly what she claimed, or she might be 2 towns over at a speakeasy with a boy her parents had forbidden her to see. There was no way to know. Cars also facilitated the death of courtship rituals. The old system, a young man calling at a young woman's home, sitting in the parlour with her family, died when couples started going on driving dates. Instead of the man coming to the woman's territory where her family could scrutinise him, the couple left together on equal footing. They went to movies, restaurants, dances, all spaces outside parental control. The balance of power shifted. For working-class flappers, cars provided escape from cramped, crowded neighbourhoods. You could drive to the countryside, breathe fresh air, experience nature, escape the noise and dirt of industrial cities. For small-town flappers, cars were tickets to urban excitement. You could drive to the nearest city, experience its culture, and return home before anyone noticed. Geography stopped being destiny. Cars also changed dating economics. In the old parlour courtship system, the young man might bring candy or flowers, but the woman's family provided the space and hospitality. In car-based dating, the man usually drove and paid for activities, establishing a dynamic where he provided and she received. This shift had complicated implications. It gave men certain expectations about what they were owed in exchange for their expenses, expectations that flappers had to negotiate carefully. But despite the complications and dangers, reckless driving killed plenty of young people, just as critics warned. Flappers embraced automobiles wholeheartedly. They posed with cars and photographs. They learned to change tyres and check oil. They drove fast, windows down, hair flying, laughing with friends. Every mile was freedom. Every turn of the wheel was independence. And when they pressed the accelerator and left town behind, watching it shrink in the rearview mirror, they were literally driving away from the past into a future they were creating themselves. Before flappers, romance followed strict rules. A man called on a woman at her home, sat in the parlour under her parents' watchful eyes, and maybe, if things went well, they'd take a chaperoned walk. Flappers demolished that system. They went on dates, a revolutionary concept where two people went out alone, split the cost, and did whatever they wanted. No chaperones, no rules, no parental supervision. They met men at parties, danced with strangers, and kissed whoever they felt like kissing. This was scandalous. Traditionalists warned that unchaperoned dating would lead to moral collapse, unwanted pregnancies, and societal ruin. They weren't entirely wrong about the risks, but flappers didn't care. They wanted to choose their own partners, make their own mistakes, and live their own lives. Dating wasn't just about romance, it was about autonomy. The old courtship system had been designed specifically to control women's sexuality and marriage choices. When a young man called on a young woman, he came to her home, her family's territory. He sat in the parlour with her parents or siblings present. Conversation was monitored. Physical contact was minimal, maybe holding hands, certainly nothing more. The woman's family could assess his character, employment prospects, family background, and suitability. If they disapproved, they could simply refuse to receive him. The system gave families veto power over their daughters' romantic choices. Courtship was also slow and formal. A man had to be properly introduced, usually by a mutual acquaintance. He couldn't just approach a woman on the street. That was for prostitutes and their customers. Once introduced, he'd ask permission to call. If granted, he'd visit regularly, always under supervision. After an appropriate period, months or years, he'd ask her father's permission to propose. Everything was regulated, monitored, controlled. Dating exploded this entire structure. The word date itself was initially slang associated with working-class young. People and prostitutes making a date was terminology from sex work. But by the 1920s, dating had become mainstream, and it was radically different from courtship. Instead of the man coming to the woman's home, they went out to movies, restaurants, dance halls, amusement parks. They were in public but anonymous. surrounded by strangers who didn't know their families and couldn't report their behaviour. This shift from private parlours to public spaces had profound implications. In parlours, women had home field advantage, they were comfortable, supported by family, in control of the space. In public spaces, men often had more power because they typically paid for activities and transportation. This created new dynamics where women might feel obligated to provide affection or sexual favours in exchange for an expensive evening. The economics of dating introduced transactional elements that hadn't existed in parlour courtship. Dating also meant meeting people your family hadn't, vetted. Flappers met men at parties, through friends, at speakeasies, in dance halls. These men might be completely unsuitable, wrong class, wrong religion, wrong ethnicity, wrong values. Parents had no ability to screen or reject them because parents often didn't know about them until the relationship was established. This terrified families who saw mate selection as too important to leave to young people's judgment. The lack of chaperones was perhaps the most revolutionary aspect. When a couple went on a date, they were alone, in cars, in dark movie theatres, in secluded corners of parks. What happened during these unsupervised hours? Everything from innocent conversation to heavy petting to sexual intercourse. And crucially, parents couldn't know. Even if nothing improper happened, the potential for scandal existed, and potential scandal could be as damaging as actual scandal. Flappers approached dating with a new attitude. They didn't wait passively to be courted, they actively pursued men they found attractive. They initiated conversations, suggested activities, made their interest clear. They dated multiple men simultaneously, comparing options, taking their time deciding. This playing the field was considered shocking. Nice girls were supposed to commit to the first suitable man who showed interest. But flappers treated dating like shopping. Why settle for the first option without seeing what else was available? Kissing became casual. In the Victorian era, a kiss was serious. It implied engagement, or at least strong intention toward marriage. Flappers kissed on first dates, kissed multiple dating partners, kissed for fun. This trivialization of kissing horrified older generations. If kissing meant nothing, what about other physical intimacies? Were all boundaries dissolving? The answer for many flappers was yes. Boundaries were dissolving, and good riddance. They believed in testing compatibility, including physical compatibility, before committing to marriage. They wanted to know if they actually enjoyed kissing someone before promising to kiss only that person for the rest of their lives. This practical approach to romance made sense to them, but seemed shockingly mercenary to traditionalists who believed in marrying first and figuring out compatibility afterward. Dating also allowed women to delay marriage. The old courtship system was designed to move quickly toward matrimony. That was its entire purpose. Dating could be an end in itself, a form of entertainment and socialization with no particular goal. Flappers dated throughout their late teens and early 20s, with no urgency about settling down. This delayed marriage age gave women more time for education and career development, and allowed them to mature before making life-altering commitments. Critics warned that dating would produce broken hearts, ruined reputations, and unwanted pregnancies. They weren't entirely wrong, all those things happened, but flappers calculated that the risks were worth the freedom. They wanted to choose their own partners based on attraction, compatibility, and genuine affection, rather than accepting whatever man their father approved of. They wanted romance, passion, and personal connection rather than arranged marriage practicality. The shift from courtship to dating represented a fundamental change in how American society understood romantic relationships. Marriage was no longer primarily an economic arrangement between families, but a personal choice between individuals. Women were no longer property to be transferred from father to husband, but autonomous agents making their own decisions. And while the transition was messy, complicated, and sometimes painful, there was no going back. Flappers had tasted the freedom to choose, and they weren't about to return to a system where their hearts and bodies were controlled by others. If dating scandalized the older generation, petting parties sent them into full meltdown mode. These were gatherings where young people engaged in kissing, cuddling, and other physical affection, things that used to happen only after marriage, if at all. Flappers saw nothing wrong with it. They believed in exploring attraction, testing compatibility, and having fun. But to conservative America, petting parties were evidence that the youth had gone completely feral. Churches condemned them. Schools held assemblies warning students away. Newspapers ran breathless exposés. Some communities even tried to ban parties altogether, but flappers just moved the action to cars, speakeasies, and private apartments. They weren't going to let a moral panic stop them from enjoying their own bodies. The term petting covered a range of physical intimacy short of intercourse, kissing, touching, caressing. By Victorian standards, any of this before marriage was scandalous. By flapper standards, it was normal courtship behaviour. The disconnect between generations was absolute. 2. Parents who had married without ever kissing their spouse. The idea of teenagers making out at parties was apocalyptic. Petting parties weren't organised events with formal invitations saying, "Come pet at my house." They were regular parties, gatherings at someone's home while parents were away, or in rented spaces or outdoors, where kissing and physical affection happened openly. Couples would pair off, find semi-private corners, and spend hours kissing. Sometimes games facilitated this. Spin the bottle, post office, other activities that required or encouraged kissing. Sometimes it was more spontaneous, with couples simply gravitating toward each other. The innovation was the openness and casualness. Previous generations had certainly engaged in premarital physical affection, but it was secretive, shameful, hidden. Petting parties normalised it, made it social, removed the stigma. Flappers discussed their petting experiences with friends. They compared notes on who was a good kisser. They laughed about awkward moments. What had been deeply private became shared cultural experience. Surveys from the period, yes, people were conducting sex surveys in the 1920s, showed that premarital petting was widespread among middle-class young people. One study found that over 90% of young women had engaged in some form of petting by age 25. This wasn't marginal behaviour by rebellious deviants. This was mainstream culture among educated, respectable young people. The moral panic was intense and revealing. Articles appeared in national magazines with titles like "The Decadence of Modern Youth" and "Are Petting Parties Destroying America?" Sociologists and psychologists weighed in, warning that petting would lead to premarital sex, venereal disease, unwanted pregnancy, and psychological damage. Religious leaders called it sinful and predicted divine punishment. School administrators held assemblies lecturing students about moral purity and self-control. What bothered adults most was the loss of control. Petting happened in spaces they couldn't supervise, at parties they didn't know about, in cars parked in dark corners, in rented apartments. Parents couldn't monitor or prevent it. Even if they forbade their children from attending parties, enforcement was impossible. Flappers simply lied about where they were going. The rhetoric around petting often focused on female virtue. The concern wasn't really about boys. Boys were expected to want sex, to push boundaries, to be aggressive. The concern was about girls who allowed or encouraged petting. Good girls were supposed to resist, to protect their purity, to save themselves for marriage. Girls who petted were failing this test, surrendering their virtue, ruining their marriage prospects. But flappers rejected this framework entirely. They didn't believe their worth was tied to their physical purity. They didn't think kissing diminished them or made them less valuable. They rejected the idea that women's bodies were commodities to be kept pristine for future husbands. Instead, they claimed ownership of their own bodies and the right to experience physical pleasure on their own terms. Petting also represented changing attitudes about sexuality and marriage. Victorian ideology held that sex was primarily procreative. Its purpose was producing children within marriage. Pleasure, especially female pleasure, was suspect or ignored. Petting divorced physical intimacy from reproduction. It was purely about pleasure, connection, and exploration. This terrified people who believed that once pleasure became the goal, all sexual restraint would collapse. There were real risks, of course. Petting could escalate to intercourse, and intercourse could result in pregnancy. A life-destroying event for an unmarried woman in the 1920s. Contraception existed but wasn't reliably available or effective, so flappers who petted were gambling, calculating that they could maintain boundaries, that they wouldn't go too far, that disaster wouldn't strike. Many managed this successfully. The distinction between heavy petting and actual intercourse was real and meaningful to most flappers. They were willing to do almost everything except the one thing that could get them pregnant. This required negotiation, self-control, and trust between partners. It wasn't always perfect. Some couples crossed lines they hadn't intended to cross. But for many, petting provided a middle path between Victorian abstinence and complete sexual freedom. The panic about petting parties also revealed class and racial anxieties. When middle-class white young people petted at parties, it was treated as a moral crisis requiring intervention and reform. When working-class or immigrant young people engaged in similar behaviour, they were dismissed as naturally immoral, beyond salvation. When black young people were discussed, which was rare in mainstream coverage, they were portrayed as animalistic, naturally sexual, incapable of restraint. The moral panic was never just about sex. It was about who got to have sex, under what circumstances, and who got to judge. By the late 20s, petting had become normalised enough that the panic subsided. Articles still appeared warning about it, but with less hysteria and more resignation. Parents might disapprove, but they couldn't stop it. Preachers might condemn it, but young people kept doing it. The battle over physical affection before marriage had been fought, and flappers had won. Not completely. Sexual double standards persisted. Women still faced harsher judgment than men, and the risks of unwanted pregnancy remained terrifying. But the Victorian insistence on total physical purity before marriage was dead, killed by flappers who insisted that their bodies belonged to themselves. One of the most radical and least talked about aspects of the flapper era was the growing access to birth control. Margaret Sanger and other activists had been fighting for years to give women control over their own reproduction, and by the 1920s that information was finally spreading. Flappers embraced it. Birth control meant they could have sex without the immediate terror of pregnancy. It meant they could delay marriage, pursue careers, and make their own choices about when and if to have children. This was revolutionary. For the first time in history, women's sexuality wasn't automatically tied to motherhood. Of course, it was still controversial, illegal in many places and difficult to access. But the flapper generation was the first to widely use contraception, and that quiet revolution changed everything. Birth control in the 1920s meant primarily diaphragms, condoms, and douches, none perfectly reliable, all difficult to obtain. The Comstock laws, passed in 1873, made it illegal to distribute information about contraception through the mail, classifying it as obscenity. Birth control advocates could be arrested, fined, and imprisoned simply for educating women about their reproductive options. Margaret Sanger was the movement's most prominent and controversial figure. a nurse who had witnessed women dying from illegal abortions and desperate attempts to end unwanted pregnancies, Sanger believed women's liberation required reproductive control. In 1916, she opened the first birth control clinic in America in Brooklyn. She was arrested after just 9 days, but she kept fighting, writing, speaking, and opening clinics. By the 1920s, despite legal obstacles, birth control information was spreading through underground networks. Sanger's pamphlets circulated secretly. Women's clubs discussed it in coded language. Doctors who were sympathetic quietly provided contraception to married women, claiming it was for health reasons, and flappers, boldly, sought it out. The psychological impact of birth control access cannot be overstated. For all of human history, sexual activity for women had carried the risk of pregnancy, a risk that could mean death in childbirth, economic ruin, social ostracism, or forced marriage. Birth control didn't eliminate these risks entirely, but it reduced them dramatically. With contraception, sex could be recreational, not just procreative. Women could enjoy physical intimacy without the terror that one encounter might derail their entire lives. This was especially important for unmarried flappers. Victorian morality insisted that women remain virgins until marriage, partly for religious reasons but mostly practical ones. An unwed mother and her illegitimate child faced catastrophic social and economic consequences. Birth control didn't make those consequences disappear, but it made premarital sex less likely to result in pregnancy, which made it less terrifyingly risky. Birth control also facilitated delayed marriage. When women could control their reproduction, they could afford to wait to marry. They could pursue education. Graduating from college was difficult if you were pregnant or raising children. They could build careers. Employers rarely retained pregnant women or mothers. They could date multiple partners without fear that one sexual relationship would trap them into marriage with the wrong person. The economic implications were profound. Women who could control when they had children could participate more fully in the workforce. They could accumulate savings, gain experience, and establish themselves professionally before taking time off for motherhood. This gave them financial independence and negotiating power in relationships. They didn't have to marry for economic survival. But access to birth control was deeply unequal. Middle-class urban flappers, with education and resources, could find sympathetic doctors or underground sources. Poor women, rural women, and women of colour often couldn't. The birth control movement itself had complicated politics. Sanger unfortunately embraced eugenics rhetoric, arguing that birth control would prevent the unfit from reproducing. This attracted support from people with racist and classist agendas who wanted to limit births among immigrant, poor, and non-white populations. Despite these troubling aspects, birth control represented genuine liberation for many women. Flappers who accessed contraception experienced sexuality differently than their mothers. They could separate pleasure from reproduction. They could have relationships based on attraction and compatibility, rather than fear and obligation. They could plan their lives rather than having biology determine their fates. The conversation about birth control also forced acknowledgement that women had sexual desires. Victorian ideology had insisted that respectable women were passionless, that they submitted to marital sex out of duty, that they had no independent sexual appetite. But if women were seeking birth control, clearly they wanted to have sex without the consequence of pregnancy. This implied, shockingly, that women actually enjoyed sex and wanted it for its own sake. Religious opposition to birth control was fierce and continued throughout the decade. The Catholic Church explicitly condemned it. Many Protestant denominations did too. Clergy argued that birth control violated natural law, encouraged promiscuity, and interfered with God's plan. Some warned it would destroy marriage by removing one of its primary purposes, reproduction. Others predicted it would lead to population decline, racial suicide, a eugenicist fear that white women wouldn't reproduce enough, and moral collapse. Legal battles continued throughout the 20s. Sanger was arrested multiple times. Clinics were raided and closed, but the movement persisted, and slowly laws began to change. By 1930, though still restricted, birth control was becoming more accessible, discussed more openly, and used more widely. For flappers, birth control wasn't just about preventing pregnancy, it was about claiming autonomy. It meant making decisions about their own bodies, their own futures, their own lives. Every diaphragm fitted, every condom used, every conversation about contraception was an assertion. Women were autonomous beings with the right to control their own reproduction. This principle, though still contested, had been established. And once established, it would never be fully dislodged. The flapper generation may not have won complete reproductive freedom, but they cracked the door open, and every generation since has pushed it wider. Flappers weren't just partying, they were working. The 1920s saw an explosion of women in the workforce. They became secretaries, telephone operators, shop girls, nurses, and teachers. Some even broke into male-dominated fields like journalism and law. Earning their own money gave flappers power. They could rent their own apartments, buy their own clothes, and make their own decisions. They didn't need to marry for financial security. This terrified traditionalists who believed women belonged in the home. But flappers loved their independence. Work wasn't just about money, it was about identity, purpose, and proving they were just as capable as men. Women's workforce participation had increased during World War I, but instead of declining afterward as expected, it continued growing throughout the 20s. By 1930, roughly 1 in 4 American women worked outside the home, a significant increase from pre-war levels. The types of jobs available were expanding too, particularly in cities where new industries created new employment categories. The clerical sector exploded. Before the war, office work had been almost entirely male. By the 20s, secretarial work, typing, filing, and switchboard operation were becoming pink-collar jobs, considered appropriate for women, even preferred. These jobs paid better than domestic service or factory work, offered cleaner and safer working conditions, and carried more social prestige. A secretary in a downtown office building was middle class, respectable, modern. Telephone operators were overwhelmingly female by the 20s. The job required patience, clear speech, and emotional composure, qualities employers believed women naturally possessed. Of course, this gendering of labour was convenient for employers who could pay women less than they'd have to pay men. But for women workers, even underpaid jobs represented independence. Retail expanded dramatically in the 20s as consumer culture boomed. Department stores hired armies of shop girls to sell the new products flooding the market. Cosmetics, ready-made clothing, household goods. These jobs were visible, social, and put women on the front lines of the consumer revolution they were also participating in as customers. Some flappers pursued higher education and entered professional fields. Women attended college in record numbers, earning degrees in education, nursing, social work, and sometimes law, medicine, or journalism. Female journalists like Dorothy Parker and Edna Ferber became cultural forces. Women lawyers slowly broke into a profession that had barred them for centuries. Female doctors, though rare, established practices and proved women could handle medicine's demands. Earning their own income transformed flappers' lives materially and psychologically. Material changes were obvious. They could afford their own fashionable clothes instead of relying on hand-me-downs. They could pay for entertainment, transportation, cosmetics. Some rented their own apartments, escaping parental supervision entirely. Others stayed home but contributed financially, giving them leverage and respect within their families. Psychological changes were deeper. Work gave women identity beyond daughter, wife, or mother. They were secretaries, teachers, journalists, roles defined by competence and contribution rather than relationships. They had colleagues, work friends, and professional networks. They developed skills and expertise. They received recognition for their abilities. Financial independence also changed power dynamics in relationships. A woman with her own income didn't have to tolerate a bad relationship or bad marriage. She could leave. She could support herself. This didn't make leaving easy. Social stigma against divorced or independent women remained intense, but it made it possible. Even the possibility shifted negotiations within relationships. Men couldn't assume complete authority over women who could theoretically walk away. The flip side was that working women faced exploitation, discrimination, and exhaustion. They were paid less than men for equivalent work, typically 50 to 60% of male wages. Advancement opportunities were limited. Most supervisory positions remained male. Sexual harassment was common and completely unaddressed. Women who complained were more likely to be fired than their harassers. Working women also faced the double shift. They were expected to maintain homes and families in addition to their paid work. Domestic labour didn't disappear because women worked outside the home. They still did cooking, cleaning, childcare, all unpaid labour that men didn't share equally. For married women especially, working outside the home often meant simply adding 8 hours of paid work to their existing domestic responsibilities. Social attitudes toward working women were contradictory. On one hand, the independent working girl became a cultural figure, admired, envied, represented in movies and magazines. On the other hand, she was also criticized as unnatural, selfish, threatening. Critics warned that working women would become too masculine, that they'd neglect their duties as wives and mothers, that they'd compete with men for jobs. Men deserved more. The marriage bar, workplace policies, requiring women to quit when they married, remained common. Teaching, in particular, routinely fired women upon marriage under the assumption that married women should be supported by husbands, and that wives working suggested their husbands were inadequate providers. This forced women to choose between career and marriage, a choice men never faced. Despite obstacles, flappers embraced work enthusiastically. They dressed professionally in tailored skirts and blouses. They commuted daily, navigating cities with confidence. They developed professional identities and took pride in their competence. And crucially, they demonstrated that women could handle complex, demanding work, that claims about female intellectual inferiority or physical delicacy were nonsense. The working flapper became an iconic figure, independent, confident, modern. She supported herself, made her own decisions, and participated fully in urban life. She proved that women could be economically self-sufficient, that they didn't need men to survive. And even when individual flappers eventually married and stopped working, they demonstrated that women's place wasn't naturally or inevitably in the home. Work was possible, viable, even preferable for many women. That realization, once reached, was irreversible. Flapper fashion wasn't just stylish, it was a manifesto sewn into silk. The iconic look, a loose, drop-waist dress covered in fringe and beads, paired with a cloche hat, rolled stockings, and T-strap heels. Everything about the outfit was designed for movement and fun. The fringe swayed when you danced. The loose fit meant comfort. The short hemline meant freedom. And the whole ensemble screamed modernity. Flappers didn't dress to please men or parents. They dressed to feel good, look good, and stand out. Fashion became a form of self-expression and rebellion. Every bead, every hem, every headband was a statement. I am young, I am free, and I am fabulous. The flapper dress was revolutionary in its simplicity. Unlike Victorian dresses with their complicated fastenings, layers of undergarments and structured silhouettes, the flapper dress slipped on easily. No corset required, in fact. Corsets were impossible with the straight silhouette. The dress hung from the shoulders, skimming the body rather than constricting it. The drop waist, positioned at the hip rather than the natural waist, created a long, lean line that emphasized legs over curves. Fabric choices reflected the era's technological advances and artistic movements. Silk was popular among those who could afford it, but rayon, a new synthetic fabric, made luxury looks accessible to working-class women. Fabrics had shine, movement, and fluidity. Art Deco patterns, geometric designs, and modernist motifs decorated surfaces. The aesthetic was sleek, angular, futuristic. Embellishments turned dresses into wearable art. Beads, glass, crystal, or jet covered entire bodices in intricate patterns. The weight of all those beads made dresses heavy despite their simple construction, but the visual effect was stunning. In dim speakeasy lighting or under dancehall chandeliers, beaded dresses sparkled and shimmered with every movement. Fringe, attached to hems and necklines, swung dramatically when flappers danced the Charleston, creating mesmerizing visual effects. Colour was bold. Gone were Victorian pastels and neutrals. Flappers wore deep jewel tones, emerald, sapphire, ruby, and striking contrasts. Black and gold, silver and crimson. Some dresses featured colour blocking or geometric colour patterns inspired by modernist art. The message was clear. We're not trying to fade into wallpaper. We're trying to be seen. The cloche hat became inseparable from flapper identity. Close-fitting and bell-shaped, it pulled down low over the forehead, covering most of the hair. This worked perfectly with bobbed hairstyles. Long hair couldn't fit under a cloche comfortably. Wearing a cloche required good posture. You had to hold your head up to see out from under the brim. This created a distinctive flapper bearing, chin lifted, gaze forward, confident. Stockings were essential and visible. With hemlines at the knee, stockings were on display, making them fashion items rather than hidden undergarments. Flesh-coloured or beige stockings were standard for day, but for evening, some flappers wore stockings with decorative patterns, seams up the back, clocks, decorative patterns at the ankle, or even hand-painted designs. Rolling stockings below the knee became a signature move, practical because it was cooler, but also rebellious because it showed more leg and suggested you didn't care about appearing completely proper. Shoes transformed too. Victorian boots that laced up the calf gave way to low-heeled pumps or T-strap shoes. Heels were modest by later standards, an inch or two, because flappers needed to dance for hours. T-straps, shoes with a strap across the instep and another strap forming a T from toe to ankle, became iconic. They stayed on during vigorous dancing and looked distinctively modern. Accessories completed the look. Long strands of pearls or beads that hung past the waist could be swung dramatically or knotted fashionably. Multiple thin bangles clinked musically on wrists. Cigarette holders, long and elegant, became fashion statements. Compacts for makeup touch-ups were both functional and decorative. Small beaded purses hung from chains or cords, hands-free and perfect for dancing. The overall aesthetic was androgynous by Victorian standards. The straight silhouette minimised breasts and hips, creating a boyish figure. Some critics complained that flappers looked like young boys in drag. Flappers took this as a compliment. They were deliberately rejecting the Victorian hourglass ideal, the exaggerated femininity that required architectural undergarments. The flapper body was slim, straight, athletic. The look suggested movement and freedom rather than decorative stasis. Fashion became more democratic during the 20s. While wealthy women bought designer dresses from Paris or New York, working-class flappers could achieve similar looks with ready-made dresses from department stores or homemade versions copied from magazine patterns. The basic flapper silhouette was simple enough that anyone with basic sewing skills could recreate it. This meant flapper style crossed class boundaries in ways Victorian fashion never had. The psychological power of flapper fashion was significant. When a woman cut her hair, put on a short dress, rolled her stockings and looked in the mirror, she saw someone modern, bold, free. The visual transformation reinforced internal changes. Fashion wasn't superficial, it was armour, identity, revolution. Every time a flapper got dressed, she was making choices about how she wanted to be seen and who she wanted to be. Critics mocked flapper fashion as ugly, masculine and ridiculous. They predicted it would quickly pass, that women would return to feminine clothing. But even as specific trends evolved, the basic principles established by flappers, comfort, freedom of movement, simpler construction, shorter hemlines, never fully reversed. Women had tasted the freedom of dressing for themselves rather than male approval, and they weren't going back. Not everyone loved flappers. In fact, most of traditional society hated them. Preachers called them sinners. Parents called them disappointments. Newspapers called them a menace to civilization. They were blamed for everything from rising divorce rates to falling birth rates to the general decline of morality. Some communities tried to regulate flapper behaviour through laws. Others relied on social shaming. Schools suspended girls for bobbed hair. Churches refused to marry couples if the bride looked too modern. But flappers didn't back down. If anything, the backlash made them bolder. They knew they were threatening the old order, and they were fine with that. The louder their enemies screamed, the higher flappers raised their hemlines. The religious backlash was fierce and constant. Ministers devoted entire sermons to the dangers of modern youth. They cited biblical passages about modesty, obedience, and proper female behaviour. They warned that God would punish a nation that allowed its daughters to dress immodestly and behave wantonly. Some predicted literal divine retribution, plagues, disasters, apocalypse, if flappers weren't stopped. Catholic bishops issued pastoral letters condemning flapper fashion and behaviour. Protestant denominations formed committees to address the youth problem. Religious organisations published pamphlets with titles like The Perils of Modern Dance and Are Young Women Losing Their Souls? Youth groups were organised to provide wholesome alternatives to speakeasies and dance halls, though these rarely attracted the young people they aimed to save. The rhetoric often focused on female purity and virtue. Flappers were described as fallen women, corrupted by modern society, tragic examples of what happened when proper guidance was lacking. The language was apocalyptic. Flappers represented the death of civilization, the collapse of morality, the end of everything good and decent. This wasn't just criticism, it was existential panic. Parents struggled with how to respond to flapper daughters. Some adapted, reluctantly accepting that times had changed. Others fought back, setting strict rules about clothing, curfews, and acceptable behaviour. These attempts usually failed. A daughter could leave the house wearing an appropriate dress and change at a friend's house. She could promise to be home by 10 and simply not return until midnight. Enforcement was nearly impossible. Family conflicts over flapper behaviour were common and sometimes severe. Some parents disowned daughters who refused to conform. Others threatened to cut off financial support if daughters continued their rebellious ways. These threats sometimes worked. Financial dependency gave parents leverage. But they also sometimes backfired, driving daughters to leave home, support themselves, and cut off contact with disapproving families. Schools became battlegrounds for controlling flapper culture. Dress codes proliferated, rules specifying hem length, sleeve length, neckline height. Some schools required students to kneel and measure the distance from knee to hem. Girls whose dresses violated the rules were sent home or suspended. Some principals inspected students' stockings to ensure they weren't rolled. The level of surveillance and control directed at female students' bodies was intense and invasive. Universities faced particular challenges. College women, living away from parental supervision and exposed to new ideas, embraced flapper culture enthusiastically. Administrators worried about institutional reputation. What would donors and parents think if the university was known as a hotbed of flapper activity? Some schools imposed strict rules governing student conduct, both on and off campus. Others hired house mothers to supervise dormitories and monitor students' behaviour. Newspapers and magazines published endless articles condemning flappers. Headlines screamed, "Is modern youth going to the dogs? The flapper, menace or merely misguided? Can America survive the flapper?" The articles combined moral outrage with pseudo-scientific analysis. Psychologists were quoted warning that flapper behaviour indicated mental instability or developmental problems. Sociologists predicted social collapse if the trend continued. Some communities attempted legal regulation. Cities passed ordinances restricting women's clothing in public spaces. A few attempted to ban jazz music or regulate dance halls. Some prohibited women from smoking in public or imposed fines for doing so. These laws were often challenged, difficult to enforce, and sometimes ruled unconstitutional, but their existence revealed the depth of anti-flapper sentiment. The backlash also had a strong class component. When wealthy socialites adopted flapper fashion and behaviour, they were criticised as frivolous, but rarely suffered serious consequences. When working-class women did the same, they were condemned as common, trashy, immoral. When women of colour embraced flapper culture, they were either ignored by mainstream coverage or subjected to explicitly racist criticism that painted them as naturally immoral and corrupting white culture. Flappers responded to criticism with defiance and humour. They mocked their critics in conversations, made jokes about stuffy ministers and uptight parents. Some deliberately escalated their rebellion when faced with opposition, raising hemlines higher, staying out later, behaving more outrageously. The criticism proved they were having an impact, threatening the old order, and that felt like validation. The generational divide was enormous. Parents who had grown up Victorian couldn't comprehend their flapper daughters. The gulf between how mothers had been raised and how daughters were living was too wide to bridge easily. Mothers had been taught that women were naturally modest, that sexual desire was primarily male, that a woman's value lay in her purity and domestic skills. Daughters rejected all of this. They insisted on being sexual beings, pursuing pleasure, prioritizing personal fulfillment over duty. Interestingly, some of the harshest critics were older women, particularly suffragettes who had fought for women's political rights. They'd endured ridicule, arrest, and violence to win the vote. Then along came flappers who seemed more interested in parties than politics, in fashion than feminism, in fun than fundamental rights. Some suffragettes saw flappers as frivolous, ungrateful, wasting the opportunities earlier generations had fought to secure. This intergenerational feminist tension was real and painful, but flappers didn't see themselves as frivolous. They saw their behaviour as deeply political, even if they didn't articulate it that way. Every act of defiance, cutting hair, raising hemlines, drinking publicly, smoking, dating without chaperones, challenged patriarchal control over women's bodies and lives. They were fighting different battles than suffragettes, but they were still fighting. And in the long run, social and sexual liberation would prove just as important as political rights. F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, published in 1925, immortalised the flapper era in fiction. Daisy Buchanan, with her voice full of money and her careless charm, became the archetype. But Fitzgerald also captured the darker side, the emptiness, the excess, the sense that all this freedom and fun was built on unstable ground. Flappers lived fast and burned bright, but underneath the glitter was anxiety, loneliness, and the knowledge that the party couldn't last forever. Fitzgerald loved flappers, and mourned them at the same time. His novels celebrated their rebellion while warning of its costs, and in doing so he created a myth that would outlive the era itself. Fitzgerald understood flappers intimately because he was married to one. Zelda Fitzgerald was the quintessential flapper, beautiful, wild, creative, and eventually tragic. She was Scott's muse, collaborator, and sometimes rival. He mined their relationship for material, turning their arguments, infidelities, and passionate reconciliations into fiction. Zelda resented this, feeling he was stealing her stories and selling them under his name. She was right, he did. But he also captured something true about flapper culture through their life together. The Great Gatsby isn't primarily about flappers, it's about class, the American dream, and the corruption underlying wealth. But Daisy Buchanan embodies flapper ideals and their limitations. She's charming, beautiful, modern. She speaks in a thrilling voice. She's magnetic. But she's also careless, shallow, destructive. She lets Gatsby take the blame for killing Myrtle Wilson. She chooses wealth and security over love. Daisy represents the flapper's dark side, the selfishness, the moral emptiness, the way privilege could insulate people from consequences. Jordan Baker, the other major female character, is more explicitly a flapper. She's a professional golfer, athletic, independent, cynical. She cheats at golf, lies casually, approaches relationships transactionally. Jordan isn't evil. She's just completely self-interested and honest about it. She represents the flapper's amorality, the rejection of Victorian ideals of feminine virtue and self-sacrifice. The parties in Gatsby, lavish, excessive, attended by hundreds of uninvited guests, captured the era's hedonism. Jazz music, flowing champagne, dancing until dawn, people behaving badly because there are no consequences and no one's watching. It's intoxicating and empty simultaneously. The parties are spectacular and meaningless. Everyone's having the time of their lives and deeply unsatisfied. This paradox, pleasure without fulfillment, defined much of the 20s for the privileged class Fitzgerald wrote about. Fitzgerald's other novels explored flappers more directly. This Side of Paradise, 1920, featured flapper characters who shocked readers with their casual attitudes towards sex and morality. The Beautiful and Damned, 1922, followed a couple's descent into alcoholism and dysfunction. Beautiful, privileged young people destroying themselves because they have everything except purpose. Tender as the Night, 1934, was even darker, exploring mental illness, addiction, and the hollowness of expatriate life. Throughout his work, Fitzgerald both celebrated and critiqued flapper culture. He was drawn to their energy, beauty, and freedom. He admired their rejection of convention, but he also saw the costs, the loneliness, the meaninglessness, the way constant pleasure-seeking led to emptiness. His flappers are glamorous and tragic, free and lost. The tension in Fitzgerald's work reflected the era's contradictions. The 20s were prosperous but built on credit and speculation. They were liberating but also alienating. Flappers had unprecedented freedom, but also unprecedented anxiety about what to do with that freedom. Old rules were gone, but new ones hadn't been established. Everyone was improvising, and it was exhilarating and terrifying. Fitzgerald also captured the class dimensions of flapper culture. His flappers are wealthy. They can afford expensive clothes, cars, endless parties. When they make mistakes, money protects them from consequences. Daisy Buchanan can kill someone and retreat into her wealth, but working-class women living flapper lifestyles faced harsher outcomes. An unwanted pregnancy destroyed a poor woman's life, but was a solvable problem for a rich one. This inequality was central to the era but often ignored in celebration of flapper freedom. The Great Gatsby's enduring popularity has shaped how we remember the 20s. The novel's imagery, jazz, parties, champagne, beautiful, reckless people, became shorthand for the entire decade. When people think Roaring Twenties, they often think of Gatsby's parties, even if they haven't read the book. This has created a myth that the 20s were non-stop glamour and fun, all flappers and jazz and champagne. The reality was more complicated. Most people weren't attending lavish parties. Most women weren't wealthy flappers living consequence-free. The decade had immense poverty, racial violence, labour strife and inequality. But Fitzgerald's vision, beautiful, flawed people dancing on the edge of disaster, captured something emotionally true even if it wasn't statistically representative. Fitzgerald also understood that the party would end. Gatsby was published in 1925 at the decade's height, but the novel is melancholic, haunted by loss and death. Fitzgerald sensed what was coming, the crash, the depression, the reckoning. His characters live fast because they unconsciously know time is running out. The green light at the end of Daisy's dock, Gatsby's symbol of hope, is always receding, impossible to reach. This captured the 20s' doomed quality, the sense that all this freedom and pleasure was temporary, built on sand. After the stock market crashed in 1929, Fitzgerald's work took on prophetic quality. He'd warned that the party couldn't last, that excess and carelessness would have consequences. The Depression seemed to prove him right. The flapper era ended, and Fitzgerald's novels became epitaphs for a vanished world. But Fitzgerald's legacy is complicated. He created beautiful prose and captured his era brilliantly. He also reinforced certain myths, that the 20s were primarily about wealthy white people, that flapper culture was morally empty, that freedom led inevitably to destruction. His work both preserves the era and distorts it, celebration and elegy, love letter and warning. Here's an uncomfortable truth. While flappers were breaking rules, most of them were breaking white middle-class rules. Black women, immigrant women, and working-class women didn't have the same freedoms. They couldn't afford the clothes, didn't have access to the clubs, and faced far harsher consequences for stepping out of line. Flappers loved jazz, but many attended segregated clubs. They admired black culture but rarely fought for black rights. The flapper movement was revolutionary, but it was also selective about who got to join the revolution. This doesn't erase their accomplishments, but it's a reminder that freedom wasn't equally distributed, even in the Roaring Twenties. The Harlem Renaissance flourished alongside flapper culture, but the two movements remained largely separate despite sharing the same era and sometimes the same geography. Harlem in the 20s was an explosion of black art, music, literature and culture. Writers like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Claude McKay created works that defined American modernism. Musicians like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong revolutionized jazz. Artists like Aaron Douglas created visual languages that honored African heritage while pushing modernist boundaries. Black flappers existed. They wore short skirts, cut their hair, went to clubs, and challenged conventions just like white flappers. Josephine Baker became an international sensation, embodying flapper style and sexuality, while navigating racism that white flappers never faced. But black women's experiences of the era were fundamentally different. They faced not just gender restrictions, but racial ones, Jim Crow laws in the South, unofficial segregation in the North, employment discrimination everywhere. When white flappers went to Harlem clubs, and many did, they were slumming, experiencing black. culture as exotic entertainment. The Cotton Club, Harlem's most famous venue, featured black performers for white audiences, but initially didn't allow black patrons unless they were celebrities. White flappers could enjoy jazz, adopt black slang, and appropriate black dance styles, then return to their segregated neighborhoods with their privilege intact. This cultural appropriation was real and harmful. Black musicians created jazz but often couldn't get recording contracts or radio airplay because of racist industry practices. White musicians like Paul Whiteman built careers performing watered-down versions of black music, earning far more money and recognition than the black artist who innovated the form. When flappers danced the Charleston, created by black Americans in Charleston, South Carolina, they rarely acknowledged or honoured its origins. Immigrant women, Italian, Jewish, Polish, Irish, also experienced the 20s differently. They often worked in factories or domestic service jobs that were poorly paid, dangerous, and offered no path to the glamorous flapper lifestyle depicted in magazines. Their communities had strong traditional values that made flapper behaviour especially transgressive. An Italian or Jewish girl who bobbed her hair might face not just parental disapproval, but community ostracism. These women also faced ethnic discrimination. Nativism surged in the 20s. The Immigration Act of 1924 established quotas that drastically reduced immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. Immigrants were portrayed as threatening American culture, bringing crime, lowering moral standards. Immigrant women who adopted flapper styles were sometimes criticized as proof that their cultures were inferior, unable to control their women. Working-class women of all races had practical barriers to flapper culture. Flapper fashion was expensive. Those beaded dresses, silk stockings, and T-strap shoes cost money that women working for poverty wages didn't have. Even if they could afford one fashionable outfit, they couldn't maintain the wardrobe variety that middle-class flappers considered essential. They also couldn't afford the activities, speakeasies, restaurants, theatres that defined flapper social life. Working-class women also faced harsher consequences for flapper behaviour. A middle-class girl who got pregnant could be quietly sent away to have the baby, which would be given up for adoption and return with her reputation mostly intact. A working-class girl lost her job, faced crushing poverty, and had few options. Middle-class flappers could experiment with rebellion knowing they had safety nets. Working-class women had no such security. The flapper movement also didn't seriously challenge racial segregation or inequality. While flappers fought for personal freedom, to vote, work, control their bodies, choose their partners, most showed little interest in extending those freedoms across racial lines. White flappers enjoyed freedoms that black, Asian, Native American, and Latina women couldn't access, and they rarely used their own liberation to advocate for others. There were exceptions. Some white flappers were genuinely committed to racial justice, participated in civil rights organizations, and used their privilege to support black causes. Some recognized that their own freedom was incomplete if it wasn't universal. But these were minorities within the flapper movement. Black women activists and writers of the era pointed out these contradictions. They celebrated gains in women's freedom while noting that black women remained excluded. They loved jazz and Harlem Renaissance culture, while resenting how it was appropriated and commodified. They wanted liberation too, but knew it would require fighting battles on multiple fronts, gender, race, class, simultaneously. The 20s also saw horrific racial violence. Race riots, lynchings, and the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan terrorized black communities. The Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921 destroyed Black Wall Street, a prosperous black business district. While white flappers danced, black Americans were fighting for basic safety and survival. This context makes the flapper era's celebration feel incomplete. Freedom and fun for some while others faced terror. Understanding this doesn't require condemning flappers. It requires complicating the narrative. The 20s weren't universally liberating. Flapper culture advanced women's rights but primarily benefited white middle-class women. Its legacy is real and important, but so are its limitations. Complete liberation requires recognizing and dismantling all forms of oppression, not just the ones that affect your own group. Modern celebrations of flapper culture often ignore these complexities, presenting a sanitized version focused on fashion and fun. But honest history requires acknowledging who was included and who wasn't, who benefited and who didn't. The flapper movement opened doors, but they weren't opened equally for everyone, and the fight for true freedom, freedom that crosses boundaries of race, class, ethnicity, and all other categories continues. The flappers started something important, but it was just a start. Hollywood fell in love with flappers, and flappers fell in love with Hollywood. Silent film stars like Clara Bow, Louise Brooks, and Joan Crawford embodied the flapper ideal on screen, gorgeous, bold, unapologetic. Clara Bow, the it girl, became the ultimate symbol of flapper sex appeal. Louise Brooks's sleek bob and sultry stare were copied by millions. These women weren't just actresses, they were influencers before influencers existed. Young women across America and the world watched their movies, copied their looks, and dreamed of their glamorous lives. Hollywood sold the flapper lifestyle as aspirational, exciting, and attainable, but it also commodified it, turning rebellion into a product you could buy with the right dress and haircut. Clara Bow defined the flapper on screen. Her 1927 film, it gave her the nickname the It Girl, it being sex appeal, charisma, magnetism. Bow played working-class shop girls who used their charm and intelligence to win over wealthy men. She was spunky, confident, and openly sexual in ways that shocked but also thrilled audiences. Her characters weren't passive Victorian maidens waiting for rescue. They were active agents pursuing what they wanted. Bow's personal life reinforced her flapper image. She dated numerous men, gambled, partied, and lived fast. Tabloids covered her romantic scandals with breathless excitement. She was working class, daughter of a Brooklyn waitress, which made her success a rags-to-riches story that resonated with ordinary women. If Clara Bow could become a star, maybe you could too. Louise Brooks brought European sophistication to the American flapper image. Her sleek, sharp bob, perfectly straight, with bangs, became the most copied hairstyle of the era. Brooks specialized in playing morally ambiguous women who didn't apologize for their desires. Her most famous role, in the German film Pandora's Box, 1929, featured her as Lulu, a sexually liberated woman who destroys everyone around her. Brooks played her with no moralizing, no punishment narrative, just raw, honest desire. Joan Crawford started as a flapper actress in films like Our Dancing Daughters, 1928, before transitioning to dramatic roles. Early in her career, she embodied the energetic, dancing, fun-loving flapper. Her characters were ambitious, modern, willing to break rules to get what they wanted. Crawford herself came from poverty and worked her way up through silent films to become one of Hollywood's biggest stars, another aspirational story. These actresses and others turned flapper style into a national obsession. Women's magazines published photo spreads of their outfits. Cosmetics companies created makeup lines inspired by their looks. Pattern companies sold dress patterns based on their costumes. Hollywood became the arbiter of flapper fashion, and women everywhere tried to recreate what they saw on screen. But Hollywood's relationship with flapper culture was complicated. While films celebrated flapper freedom and fun, they often included moral lessons. Flapper characters who went too far faced consequences, unwanted pregnancies, social ruin, sometimes death. The message was mixed. Being a flapper is exciting, but don't actually do what flappers do or you'll suffer. The production code, established in 1930, though not strictly enforced until 1934, codified these moral boundaries. Films couldn't show crime, immorality, or sexual impropriety without punishment. Flappers on screen became more sanitized, their rebellion softened and made safe for conservative audiences. The pre-code era, late 20s through early 30s, was Hollywood's wildest period, when flapper films pushed boundaries. After enforcement, that freedom disappeared. Hollywood also created impossible beauty standards. Movie stars had professional stylists, makeup artists, lighting designers, and retouchers making them look perfect. Ordinary women trying to recreate their looks couldn't achieve the same results without those resources. This created insecurity and drove consumption. Women bought cosmetics, clothes, and beauty treatments trying to match Hollywood glamour. The silent film era was particularly important for flapper culture because without dialogue, actresses had to convey personality through movement, expression, and physicality. This suited the flapper aesthetic perfectly. It was visual, performative, based on gesture and energy. When talkies arrived in the late 20s, some silent stars couldn't transition because their voices didn't match their images. Others, like Joan Crawford, successfully adapted. Hollywood also exported American flapper culture globally. American films played in theaters worldwide, spreading flapper fashion, music, and attitudes internationally. Women in Europe, Latin America, Asia saw American flappers on screen and adopted elements of the style. This cultural imperialism had complicated effects, spreading women's liberation ideas but also imposing American values and beauty standards. The movie industry used flappers to sell products beyond films. Actresses endorsed cosmetics, clothing, cigarettes, cars. Their images appeared in advertisements linking products to glamorous Hollywood lifestyles. This created a consumer culture feedback loop. Movies made flappers famous. Flappers sold products. Products allowed ordinary women to emulate flappers, which created demand for more flapper films. Hollywood's treatment of racial diversity was abysmal. Black actresses were relegated to racist stereotypes, maids, mammies, servants. They couldn't play flappers or romantic leads. Asian actresses like Anna May Wong faced similar limitations, typecast as exotic others or villains. Latina actresses were nearly invisible. Hollywood's flapper was white by default and design. Studios also controlled actresses' personal lives through morality clauses in contracts. They could be fired for behavior that damaged their image or the studio's reputation. This created a strange dynamic where actresses played sexually liberated flappers on screen, but were expected to maintain pristine reputations off-screen. Those who didn't, like Clara Bow, faced career consequences when scandals broke. Despite limitations and contradictions, Hollywood actresses were genuinely influential. They showed millions of women what independence and confidence looked like. They made flapper culture visible, aspirational, discussed. Young women seeing Clara Bow or Joan Crawford on screen saw possibilities for their own lives. Maybe they couldn't become movie stars, but they could adopt elements of that. Freedom, confidence, and modernity. The flapper film star became an enduring archetype, the independent woman who knows what she wants and goes after it, who's sexual without shame, who doesn't wait for permission. This character type persisted in Hollywood long after the 20s ended, evolving but never disappearing, and that persistence is part of the flappers' legacy. They created templates for women's representation that still influence how we see women in media today. The relationship between flappers and the feminist movement was complicated. Early feminists, the suffragettes who fought for voting rights, often disapproved of flappers. They thought flappers were frivolous, focused on fun instead of serious political change. Flappers, in turn, thought feminists were boring and preachy. But in hindsight, both groups were fighting the same battle in different ways. Suffragettes demanded legal equality. Flappers demanded social and sexual freedom. Both were challenging patriarchy. They just had different methods. And while flappers didn't march in protests or lobby for laws, their everyday rebellion, cutting their hair, wearing short skirts, refusing to be controlled, was deeply political. Sometimes revolution happens in the streets. Sometimes it happens on the dance floor. The suffragettes, who had fought for decades to win voting rights, looked at flappers with confusion and often disapproval. Women like Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul had endured ridicule, arrest, forced feeding during hunger strikes, and social ostracism to secure the 19th Amendment in 1920. They'd argued that women deserved the vote because they were morally superior to men, more pure, more civic-minded. They'd presented themselves as dignified, respectable, serious. And then along came flappers, smoking, drinking, dancing, kissing strangers, embodying everything the suffragettes had insisted women weren't. Some older feminists saw flappers as squandering the opportunities they'd fought to create. They'd won the vote, and flappers seemed more interested in lipstick than legislation. They'd argued that women could contribute meaningfully to society, and flappers seemed focused on parties and pleasure. It felt like betrayal, like the younger generation didn't appreciate the sacrifices made for them. But this perspective misunderstood what flappers were doing. The suffragettes had fought for political rights, voting, property ownership, access to education and professions. These were crucial battles. But flappers were fighting for something equally important: bodily autonomy, sexual freedom, the right to exist as full human beings rather than decorative angels or domestic servants. They were challenging the private sphere in ways suffragettes hadn't fully addressed. The suffragette movement had been careful, strategic, conservative in many ways. They'd argued that giving women the vote wouldn't change anything fundamental about gender roles. Women would still be wives and mothers, just politically engaged ones. Flappers weren't interested in that compromise. They wanted everything to change. They rejected the idea that women were naturally more moral, more pure, more domestic. They insisted on being fully human, complex, flawed, sexual, ambitious, selfish, joyful. There were generational tensions beyond politics. Older feminists had lived through the Victorian era, absorbed its values even while fighting its restrictions. They believed in propriety, respectability, gradual change through proper channels. Flappers had no patience for that. They'd grown up during World War I, watched millions die, seen the world explode. Victorian propriety seemed not just outdated, but obscene in the face of that carnage. Why be proper when life was short and brutal? Some feminists did recognise flappers as allies. Crystal Eastman, a socialist feminist, saw flapper behaviour as fundamentally political. She understood that personal choices about clothing, sexuality and lifestyle were challenges to patriarchal control. Margaret Sanger, fighting for birth control access, certainly recognised that sexual freedom required reproductive control. These women saw connections between different forms of women's liberation. But many mainstream suffragettes couldn't make that connection. They saw flappers as embarrassments who would undo the progress they'd made. If women behaved immorally, men would conclude they'd been right all along. Women couldn't be trusted with freedom. The vote might be repealed, professional opportunities might close, everything they'd won might be lost because flappers couldn't behave responsibly. Flappers, for their part, often dismissed older feminists as uptight, joyless scolds. They didn't want to sit in meetings discussing legislation. They didn't want to present themselves as morally superior beings deserving of respect. They wanted to live, to dance, drink, love, work, make mistakes, have adventures. They weren't interested in proving they deserved freedom. They were simply taking it. This divide also reflected class differences. Many prominent suffragettes were wealthy, educated women with social standing to maintain. Flapper culture emerged partly from working-class young women who had less to lose socially. Middle-class flappers were rebelling against their mother's world. Working-class flappers were creating new possibilities that hadn't existed for them before. The reality is that both movements were necessary. Legal rights without social freedom are incomplete. You can vote, but still be trapped in suffocating gender roles. Social freedom without legal protection is fragile. You can live however you want, but have no recourse if someone discriminates against you. Suffragettes and flappers needed each other, even if they didn't realize it. Modern feminism recognizes this. Contemporary feminist theory understands that liberation requires both structural change, laws, policies, institutions and cultural change, attitudes, behaviours, norms. You can't have one without the other. The suffragettes built the legal framework. Flappers challenged the cultural framework. Together they created space for women's lives to expand in multiple directions. It's also worth noting that both groups face similar criticisms. Suffragettes were called unfeminine, told they wanted to be men, accused of neglecting their families. Flappers heard identical attacks. Both were threatening patriarchal assumptions about women's nature and proper roles. The establishment didn't distinguish between political feminists and social rebels. Both were dangerous. Both needed to be stopped. Looking back, the conflict between suffragettes and flappers seems tragically unnecessary. They were on the same side, fighting the same enemy from different angles. If they'd recognised their common cause, they might have been even more effective. But generational divides are real, and people fighting for freedom don't always agree on tactics or goals. The flappers' feminist legacy is clear, even if they didn't call themselves feminists. Every woman who's worn pants, cut her hair short, lived with a partner without marrying, pursued casual relationships, prioritised career over family, or simply existed as a full, complicated human being owes something to flappers. They didn't achieve complete liberation. No single generation could. But they kicked down doors that had been locked for centuries. And once those doors were open, subsequent generations walked through and kept pushing forward. On October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashed, and the Roaring Twenties screeched to a halt. The Great Depression hit like a sledgehammer, wiping out fortunes, jobs, and futures overnight. Suddenly, the flapper lifestyle, carefree, excessive, pleasure-seeking, felt tone-deaf. People were starving, losing their homes, standing in breadlines. Jazz clubs closed. Speakeasies shut down. The party was over. Flappers, who had defined the decade with their rebellious joy, were now seen as symbols of a reckless, irresponsible era. Hemlines dropped. Hair grew longer. Sobriety returned. The world got serious again. But even as the flapper era ended, its impact didn't. The women who had tasted freedom weren't going to forget it. The crash wasn't entirely unexpected. Some economists had warned that speculation was unsustainable, that the market was overvalued, that disaster loomed. But most people ignored these warnings because ignoring them was more profitable and more fun. When the crash came, it was swift and catastrophic. Fortunes evaporated, banks failed, businesses collapsed. Within months, unemployment soared from roughly 3% to over 20%. For flappers, the economic collapse meant immediate practical changes. Jobs disappeared, especially the clerical and retail positions many working women held. Companies laid off workers, and women were typically first to go under the assumption that men needed jobs more because they supported families. Never mind that many women were supporting families too. Patriarchal logic didn't account for that. Women who had been financially independent suddenly couldn't support themselves. They moved back in with families if families could afford to take them back. Some married men they might not have chosen otherwise because economic security became more important than romantic compatibility. The luxury of choosing whether to marry, which flappers had enjoyed, evaporated. Marriage rates actually dropped during the Depression. People couldn't afford weddings or households, but women's bargaining power in relationships declined. The cultural shift was equally dramatic. The carefree hedonism that had defined the 20s suddenly seemed obscene. How could you justify spending money on cosmetics, fashionable clothes and speakeasy drinks when people were starving? The moral criticism that flappers had laughed off during prosperous times gained traction during hardship. Maybe the critics had been right all along. Maybe all that pleasure-seeking and rule-breaking had angered God or violated natural law, and the Depression was punishment. Fashion reflected the mood shift. Hemlines dropped dramatically. By 1932, skirts fell to mid-calf or ankle. Waistlines returned to their natural position. Silhouettes became more feminine, emphasizing curves again. Hair grew longer. The boyish flapper look disappeared almost overnight, replaced by a more traditionally feminine aesthetic. It was as if society collectively decided that women's rebellion had caused the crash, and returning to traditional femininity might fix things. Prohibition ended in 1933, removing one of the flapper era's defining features. Speakeasies became legal bars or closed entirely. The thrill of breaking the law, of secret passwords and hidden clubs was gone. Drinking became ordinary again, which somehow made it less exciting. The integration that had happened in some speakeasies, different races and classes mixing, largely disappeared as legal establishments returned to segregation. The entertainment industry changed too. Jazz, associated with flapper excess, fell out of mainstream favour temporarily. Swing music emerged, still jazz-based but more orchestrated, more respectable. Dance halls that had featured wild Charleston dancing now hosted sedate foxtrots. Hollywood, facing economic pressure, produced more wholesome content. The pre-code era's sexual frankness gave way to heavily censored films that reinforced traditional values. Psychologically, the shift was jarring for women who had embraced flapper life. They'd believed they were creating a new world where women were free, equal, autonomous. The Depression seemed to prove that world unsustainable. Economic hardship reinforced dependence on men, on families, on traditional structures. The independence flappers had fought for felt fragile, easily destroyed by forces beyond their control. Some flappers adapted, became more serious, focused on survival rather than pleasure. They took whatever work they could find, domestic service, factory work, anything. They mended clothes instead of buying new. They stopped going out, saved every penny, helped families survive. The skills their mothers had tried to teach them, thrift, domesticity, sacrifice, suddenly became essential. Others struggled with the transition. Women who had built identities around being modern, independent and free felt lost when that identity became impossible to maintain. Some fell into depression, the psychological kind compounding the economic kind. Some turned to radical politics, joining communist or socialist movements that promised to rebuild society more justly. If capitalism had failed, maybe an alternative system deserved a chance. But despite the Depression's devastating impact, the freedoms flappers had claimed didn't disappear entirely. Women didn't return to wearing corsets. They didn't stop working, even if jobs were scarce. They didn't forget that they'd once chosen their own partners, controlled their own money, made their own decisions. The Depression forced compromises, but it didn't erase the previous decade's gains. World War II, beginning in Europe in 1939 and involving America in 1941, would eventually recreate some conditions that had liberated women during World War I. Men would leave for war, women would fill jobs, traditional roles would be disrupted. Rosie the Riveter would emerge, a different kind of independent woman than the flapper, but built on the same foundation, the knowledge that women could do men's work and do it well. The flapper era's end was abrupt and painful, but its legacy persisted. The women who had been flappers became mothers, and they raised daughters differently than they'd been raised. They didn't force them into corsets or insist on Victorian propriety. They remembered freedom and wanted their daughters to have it too, even if the world had temporarily closed doors. And those daughters, coming of age in the 40s and 50s, would eventually spark new rebellions, new movements, new pushes toward liberation. The flappers' granddaughters would become second-wave feminists, and the cycle would continue. So tonight, as you settle into your clean bed with your central heating and indoor plumbing, maybe take a moment to think about the flappers, those bold, reckless, brilliant women who looked at a world designed to cage them and simply said, "No thanks." They weren't perfect. They made mistakes. They sometimes hurt people, including themselves. Their revolution wasn't equally accessible to everyone, and they didn't always recognize their own privilege. But they did something that had never been done before. They claimed freedom without asking permission. They cut their hair and didn't apologize. They shortened their skirts and danced anyway. They smoked and drank and dated and worked and lived on their own terms, knowing full well that society would judge them, condemn them, and try to stop them. And society did try. Preachers thundered from pulpits. Parents wept and threatened. Schools suspended and expelled. Communities shamed and ostracized. Laws were proposed to regulate hem lengths and ban public smoking. The backlash was real, constant, and sometimes brutal. But the flappers kept dancing. What they left behind wasn't just fashion or music or a nostalgic aesthetic we trot out for themed parties. They left behind something far more valuable: proof. Proof that women could work and the economy wouldn't collapse. Proof that women could control their own reproduction and society wouldn't end. Proof that women could be sexual beings and still be worthy of respect. Proof that women could choose their own partners, make their own decisions, and live their own lives. They kicked down doors that had been locked for centuries. And yes, many of those doors tried to slam shut again during the Depression, during the war, during the 1950s backlash. But they never closed completely. Because once you've walked through a door into freedom, you remember. You remember what it felt like to breathe without a corset, to move without dragging 5 pounds of fabric, to make choices about your own body and life. And you don't forget. And you teach your daughters not to forget either. Every woman today who wears pants, who has a career, who chooses when or if to have children, who lives with a partner without marrying, who expresses her sexuality without shame, who simply exists as a full, complicated human being rather than a decorative object or domestic servant. Every one of those women owes something to the flappers, not everything. The fight for liberation didn't start with them, and it certainly didn't end with them, but they were crucial links in a long chain of women refusing to accept less than full humanity. The flapper era lasted barely a decade. 10 years of bobbed hair, short skirts, jazz music, and deliberate rule-breaking. But the impact echoed across the century that followed and continues echoing today. Because what the flappers really proved was this: change is possible. Women's subordination isn't natural law or divine will, it's a social construction. And what's constructed can be deconstructed. The cage can be opened. Freedom can be claimed. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe spare a thought for those rebellious, exhausted, brave, flawed women who danced the Charleston in smoky speakeasies, who smoked cigarettes on street corners despite the stares, who cut their hair and changed the world. They didn't do it perfectly. They didn't do it equally. But they did it anyway, and we're all living in the world they helped create. History may remember them for their fashion and their parties, for the glitz and glamour and jazz-soaked nights. But what really matters is simpler and more profound. They refused to be controlled. They insisted on joy. They claimed autonomy. They lived loudly in a world that told them to be quiet. And in doing so, they proved that revolution doesn't always look like marching or legislating or organizing. Sometimes it looks like dancing. Sometimes it looks like a haircut. Sometimes it looks like one woman, then another, then thousands, simply refusing to live according to rules they never agreed to follow. The flappers may be gone, but the doors they opened remain. And every time a woman walks through one of those doors into freedom, whether it's freedom to work, to love, to choose, to exist, she's walking in the footsteps of women who danced on the edge of disaster and refused to stop dancing. So rest easy tonight. The world is far from perfect. The fight for liberation continues. But thanks to the flappers and countless women before and after them, we're living in a world where freedom is possible, where women can dream beyond domestic cages, where rebellion is remembered and revolution is always just one bold choice away. Sleep well. And maybe tomorrow, do something that would make a flapper proud. Cut your hair if you want to. Wear what makes you feel fabulous. Make your own choices. Live on your own terms. Dance like the world is ending, or at least like you don't care what anyone thinks, because that, in the end, is the flapper's true legacy. Not the beads or the fringe or the champagne, but the radical idea that women deserve to be free, to be joyful, to be fully, completely, unapologetically themselves. Good night.